Chapter 441. The Sky City Lord Ophelia. Saul left the confused little algae behind and walked alone to the second floor to inspect the things it had brought up. There wasn't much dust on the letter. It was probably delivered here sometime in the past few months. The book wrapped in tree resin seemed to have been submerged in water. It still bore traces of algae. Saul opened the letter first. The signature at the bottom was Sander. He thought for a moment before recalling. It was that man who had hidden his sister in a box to avoid the ship fare, only to discover after disembarking that his sister had died. But it wasn't suffocation that killed her. She died in the Soul Tide at Blue Water Bay. The contents of the letter were simple. Sander claimed he had discovered the cause behind the Soul Tide at Blue Water Bay and hoped Saul would come investigate if he had the time. Sander was probably trying to ask Saul to resolve the issue at Blue Water Bay, but lacking the means to pay the proper price, he had chosen instead to dig up some secrets, hoping to lure Saul over. To be fair, for the sake of his sister, Sander was indeed taking a great risk. However, the secret of Blue Water Bay likely involved the gray matter, and the gray matter was the secret weapon Ans and the others planned to use against Master Gorsa. Saul opened his diary in his mental realm. "I'm so bored, have you taken control of me? Want to make a deal?" Currently, the only remaining consciousness within the diary was Lockeye. And the white writing on Lockeye's black page was already far less distinct than when it first appeared. If Locke couldn't enter the mental realm and receive Saul's soul energy as sustenance, he would completely vanish once his last bit of energy was consumed. Though Locke had only ever reached second rank in the end, as the leader of the Apprentice Mutual Aid Society in the Wizard Tower, the information and knowledge he possessed were far beyond the average apprentice. Still, Saul had no interest in making any deals with Lockeye. The diary would compel Lockeye to speak the truth anyway, and Saul had no desire to keep this man's consciousness around. Gray matter was discovered in Blue Water Bay. Did you ever find out how it formed, and how is it related to the Soul Tide? Saul figured that while Sander clearly intended to use him to uncover the secret behind the Soul Tide, he certainly wouldn't dare lie. If he said there was a secret, then there must truly be something he had found. With Saul's question, even if Lockeye wanted to hide something, he couldn't. The Soul Tide was actually caused by a great battle at Blue Water Bay 100 years ago. A lot of people died, and some terrifyingly powerful magical artifacts were used, which led to the sea being polluted overall. Though there was some cleanup afterward, a vast amount of resentment and evil thoughts was left behind. The lingering evil thoughts continue to harm others, creating more deaths, which is why the Soul Tide reemerges every few years. Later, we discovered an enormous concentration of evil thoughts hiding beneath the sea. Combined with the fact that Master Gorsa's condition was growing strange, we came up with the idea of using those evil thoughts to hasten his corruption and take the opportunity to kill him. Saul tapped his fingers lightly on the desk. So Lady Yura was convinced by you all, and she used herself to absorb the evil thoughts, intending to infect Master Gorsa at the critical moment. Yes, though it wasn't exactly that we persuaded her. She had long since given up the will to live. She was willing to kill the very man who kept resurrecting her, Gorsa. Saul didn't ask why Yura didn't want to be resurrected anymore. Ever since he learned that the heart-wrenching "kill me" inside the puppet came from Yura, he could well imagine living in a state between life and death, constantly used in resurrection experiments, could never be anything close to comfortable. Maybe only the words, "a fate worse than death," could describe it. You all discovered something was wrong with Gorsa's body, gained Yura's cooperation, then found the evil thoughts capable of corrupting him, and used the grinding sound fruit to conceal Yura's anomaly. That's when your reversal plan began. But it was full of uncertainty. Weren't you afraid of failing? Since we chose to become wizards, we must dare to take risks. The mediocre will never become true wizards. Master Ans wanted the Wizard Tower, Mentor Rum wanted to split Gorse's corpse with Mentor Guido, and I wanted to freely select third-rank apprentices to cultivate parasites. Saul had to admit, each of those was a very tempting reward, enough to risk one's life for. Seems like your harvest at Blue Water Bay was quite rich. The reason the soul tides stopped appearing frequently these past years is that because you removed the evil thoughts beneath the sea. Actually, the frequent soul tides before were due to someone cultivating evil thoughts. A tide every few months is far beyond what's normal for the Western Stat region. Then where exactly do those wraiths reside, and what keeps making them stronger? But Lakai didn't know the origin of the wraiths either. They were merely the ones picking the fruit. It was just that the one who planted the tree had never shown up. In the end, Lakai could only tell Saul where the soul tides were originating from. At that point, his diary page had worn so thin that only a faint trace remained. Though Saul hadn't yet unraveled the mystery of Blue Water Bay, at least he now knew where to go for clues. Finally, Saul pulled his hand away and asked one more question. Who else have you planted parasites on? Lakai didn't want to say, but he couldn't resist the urge to confess. The continent of Iskaper sat between the Stat and Nefrit continents. It was closer to the Stat continent. On the northern coast of Iskaper lay a special archipelago, the Sky Island. At the center of the Sky Island stood the legendary Sky City, known throughout the entire wizarding world. As the name implied, Sky City was a floating city suspended in the sky. Though its area was not large, it gathered the top wizards from all three continents. It was said that unless one had the strength of a second-rank wizard, they wouldn't even be allowed to set foot in the city. The city lord of the Sky City was a fourth-rank wizard. And apart from those mysterious fifth-rank wizards who might no longer exist in this world, the fourth rank represented the pinnacle of power. On this day, Sky City's Lord Ophelia held a secret meeting with someone in her white glazed palace. You've been stirring up trouble outside these past few years, and recently stayed in the Western Stat region for quite a while. What? Don't want to come back and see me anymore? Ophelia sat inside a transparent glazed vase with only her head protruding. Her body, suspended in the transparent glass, resembled a blended mess of crushed strawberry and banana milkshake. Red, yellow, and white viscous fluids entangled and fused together, with no way to distinguish limbs or organs. And in this white glazed palace, there were over 1,000 such vases. Kismet stood below, gazing up at the high platform. More like an offering than a guest, he looked at Ophelia with a smile on his lips, though his eyes were slightly dim. Of course not, dear Lady Ophelia. The reason I stayed so long in the Western Stat region was all to gather more pages of fate. Ophelia's head rotated a full circle, the liquid inside her glass vase swirling slowly along with it. You said that as long as you gathered enough pages of fate, you could find your original master. But by now, you must have at least 4 pages right. Why is there still no sign of your former master? Kismet's eyes dimmed further, and he replied helplessly, Maybe my original master has been gone too long, too far away. Perhaps these pages just aren't enough for him to sense me. Fine then, Ophelia said flatly. I'm still willing to let you continue trying, but just remember, I am your master now. Don't go running off the moment your old one returns. Kismet's smile became strained. He lowered his head and murmured softly, I wouldn't. Ophelia suddenly laughed. Her neck extended half a meter from the vase. Had the proportions not been so off, it would have made a stunning swan's neck. Your blood is flowing faster now. What's wrong, unhappy? Her laugh turned a little cold. Do you not see me as your master? Don't forget, it was I who awakened you from chaos. Or do you still want to return to being a mindless, unfeeling feather pen? Chapter 442, The Will to Resist. Ophelia's threat made Kismet recall the days he had spent drifting in the depths of the ocean. Compared to that time, his current life was at least not so full of despair. He lifted his head once more, and a sincere smile was already on his face. Dear Lady Ophelia, the moment my former master abandoned me, he ceased to be my master. I will not forget who my current master is. Ophelia stared into Kismet's silver eyes for a while before letting out a light laugh. Little liar. Then she withdrew into the vase. Her slender swan-like neck, upon entering the glass vase, was instantly twisted into a pulp-like mass, mixing into the original liquid inside. You'll be staying in Escaper for a while. Go play anywhere you want, as long as it's not Sky City. Kismet gave a graceful gentleman's bow. Thank you ever so much. Your character shines even brighter than your beauty. Sweet-tongued, Ophelia wasn't swayed. When you were on the western continent of Stat, did you also make a move against Gorsa? I merely caused him a bit of minor trouble. How would I dare to target a third rank? Hearing that from you makes it completely unbelievable. Ophelia's head was halfway into the bottle, her final words drifting in the air. Gorsa is the prodigy of this generation of the Glare family. If you weave his fate into book pages, the fourth rank of Glare won't let you off. Kismet merely chuckled. Rest assured, my lady, I'll be careful. I won't let myself get tangled in it. The Glare family had an entire world side to themselves. A world side was a fragment of a broken world that, after connecting with the main world, was absorbed and became a small space attached to it. Upon entering this world side, one would immediately see hundreds of wizard towers standing like fortress walls at the entrance. These wizard towers varied greatly in shape, height, and style, completely lacking any sense of uniform beauty. As Gorsa walked alone into this world side, a man's voice emerged from a nearby lion statue. Gorsa, you finally returned. Gorsa stood still, not advancing. Within minutes, someone came rushing over. But the attitude of this greeter was anything but friendly. Only 4 years left until the deadline. If you hadn't caused trouble out there this time, were you planning to wait until the final moment before coming back? It was a middle-aged man with golden hair and a beard. The moment Gorsa saw him, his brows furrowed. The man raised his chin, eyes filled with undisguised mockery. You have been running away for so many years without paying any attention to the family mission you have undertaken. The patriarch spoils you so-called prodigies far too much. Someone like you, blessed with excellent magic talent, should obediently stay in the family's territory and produce more outstanding offspring for us. Tusk, Gorsa clicked his tongue at that. You are already a second-rank wizard but still think yourself as a house dog. The man wasn't angered, he even curled his lips slightly. So what, aren't you back to being a house dog too? Gorsa's cloak gave a light flick, and a powerful surge of magic erupted from him. The man, once smug, suddenly fell silent as if his throat were being squeezed shut. His eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at Gorsa. How strange, Gorsa said with a smile. You seem to know I'm a family prodigy, yet you always forget it. He stepped toward the man, one foot after the other. Now greet me properly. The man's eyes quivered. In an instant, all emotions disappeared from his face. He slowly knelt on one knee, placing both hands together at his forehead. Welcome back, Lord Gorsa. Gorsa paid no more attention to the provocateur. Among wizards, struggling over knowledge and resources was common. Arrogance was merely a mask for conflict of interest. He proceeded smoothly to one of the less conspicuous wizard towers. Ever since he stopped concealing his magical power, no one had dared to obstruct him again. Eventually, he descended into the depths of the tower. The place was pitch black, no visible surroundings, no sound. But the moment he entered the darkness, a voice echoed in his mind. "You've advanced to third rank." "Yes." "Using Glaire's power to do so." "Yes." "You understand the responsibilities of a third rank within the Glaire family." "I do." "There are 2 empty wizard towers here. The northern mountains of Stat have 5. Gorsa suddenly interrupted the voice in the dark. "Why are there 5 wizard towers again in the northern mountains? Didn't Camus go there just 100 years ago?" Silence followed in the dark, almost 5 minutes with no response. "Dead, taken by the black tide of the abyss." Gorsa chuckled lightly. "Then I'll inherit his wizard tower." "His tower is closer to the Wall of Sighs. It's isolated from the others." "Perfect." "The family still hopes you'll focus on reaching the 4th rank. We haven't had a new 4th rank in a long time." But Gorsa was already heading out. "I need a more suitable place to continue my experiments." A few days later, Saul set out for Blue Water Bay with a cart full of luggage. To conserve magic, he had the other consciousnesses return to the diary, leaving only Agu in the open. Among the 4 consciousnesses, Agu was the clearest-headed and most well-versed in various fields of knowledge, making him a great aid when traveling. After spending a night in a lakeside cabin, Saul decided to take an airship to Blue Water Bay. He figured that before news of Gorsa's departure from the Wizard Tower spread, he could hitch another free ride. As it turned out, by coincidence, the ship he boarded was once again captained by the business-savvy Captain Harry. When Harry discovered Saul's name among the guests, he enthusiastically came over to greet him and took the chance to promote some newly developed magical items from Baton Academy. Saul was indeed interested in a few of them, especially the 2nd-generation compression bag. Not only was it twice as spacious, but it could also be used with special sealing items to store living beings. However, the new bag could only be purchased in Kaugus City, where Baton Academy was located. The airship merely advertised it. After all, the item was too valuable. As an ordinary man, Harry had no way to protect it. Still, though Saul didn't buy anything, he chatted with Captain Harry for a bit, subtly inquiring about the reactions of various factions to the collapse of the Wizard Tower. Though Harry was just a regular person, his travels gave him access to many rumors. The 2 strolled slowly across the deck. At first, the surrounding factions were getting restless, but ever since Tower Master Gorsa suddenly appeared on the battlefield with reinforcements and directly killed 2 2nd-rank wizards from Kinas, everything quieted down. Captain Harry spoke enthusiastically. He tried to appear open and composed, but his every gesture still showed a hint of respectful restraint. "Now everyone knows Tower Master Gorsa has advanced to 3rd rank. Those who once had ill intentions are all worried they'll face retribution." At that point, Harry cautiously asked, "Lord Saul, do you think Tower Master Gorsa will start a purge?" But Saul didn't respond. "Lord Saul," Harry called again. Still, Saul didn't react. Only then did Harry nervously lift his head and discover that Saul was staring in a certain direction on the ship, a glint of coldness seeming to seep from his eyes. "Harry," Saul said, slightly turning his head though his gaze remained locked forward, "this ship of yours, how well can it take a hit?" "My lord," Harry stammered, his legs already trembling beneath him, nearly giving out. Chapter 443, Ambush. Saul stared intensely at the figure opposite him. He was not hiding the murderous intent in his eyes. Near the bow of the airship, close to the cabin entrance, 2 people were walking slowly. One of them was supporting the other. The one Saul was watching was the one being supported. He was wearing a long cloak. When the wind blew, it clung to his body, revealing an unusually thin figure. The man appeared to be in poor health, constantly covering his mouth as he coughed, occasionally even retching. The other person held his arm, speaking to him with a look of concern. Saul kept his gaze fixed on them, not at all worried about being noticed. After devouring a new batch of veiled crystal essence, the nightmare butterfly Penny had grown stronger. She could now influence others, perception and awareness to a certain degree. Even if Saul were to stare at his target for a full day, as long as the latter's strength didn't surpass Saul's mental power, he would remain oblivious. "Brother Saul, I've confirmed it, that's Guido. Ha, he never expected this, did he? No matter how well you disguise yourself, a soul body can't lie." Penny fluttered her wings, dancing in front of Saul's eyes. Back under the wizard tower, she had once clashed with Guido to buy Saul some time, though she had ultimately been driven out of his soul body. Now seeing Guido again naturally made her bristle with disgust. As for Saul, there was no need to mention it. Poisoned, hunted down, and with Kelly's death still unavenged. He had been sulking over Guido's escape, but who would have thought he'd run right into him on an airship today? Saul took a step forward, walking steadily and purposefully toward the drastically changed Guido. Beneath his feet, semi-transparent gray tendrils undulated along the deck like smoke, spreading in all directions. After the battle at the Wizard Tower, Saul gradually discovered that his soul fishing ability could now split into multiple strands, just like little algae. Although each strand weakened with further division, even a single one was now far more powerful than before. These tendrils slithered quietly to every corner of the deck, then began encircling Guido from the outside inward. Their movement was careful and discreet. Not only that, but Saul also extended both his mental power and magic along the tendrils of soul fishing, layering a new third-rank spell, Shadow Bind, on top of them through a secondary resonance. This spell allowed Saul's attacks to blend into the surrounding shadows, making them even harder to detect. At the moment of activation, it would also induce a dizzying effect, increasing the odds of soul fishing landing successfully. Ahead, neither the disguised Guido nor the man supporting him noticed the encircling attack. Elsewhere on the airship, there were no other first-rank wizards. Even if there were some advanced apprentices, under the combined veil of Nightmare Butterfly and Shadow Bind, none could perceive the ambush unfolding. The smoke-like tendrils crept ever closer to the pair, nearing the cabin entrance. In Saul's vision, tendrils were even extending along the walls of the passageway, their tips all aimed precisely at the two. Everything was set. The clear sky and the clean deck would soon transform into a prison of shadows and smoke the moment Guido stepped into the final ambush zone. But just as Saul's trap was closing in, and the fatal blow was about to be unleashed, a white blur suddenly dropped from the sky. It was shockingly fast, piercing through the last gap in Saul's encirclement just as it was about to close, hurtling straight toward Guido and his companion. Someone else was intervening. Saul narrowed his eyes, immediately surging his mental power. His shadows and tendrils, already primed, launched toward the center in a furious assault. But Saul's attacks were not built for speed. Even though he triggered the trap as fast as he could, the white blur was still a second faster, and pierced into the brain of the man beside Guido. At the same moment, Guido, whose body had been tightly wounded like a spring, reacted instantly to the assault. His lower abdomen and arms exploded. From the explosion surged black smoke shaped like savage beasts, tearing through the air without regard for friend or foe. Even the man who had been helping him was attacked. The unfortunate man screamed in both voice and soul, his agony disrupting part of Saul's attack. Soul Toxin. Saul immediately recognized the black beast-like mist erupting from Guido. It was the enhanced version of the soul toxin that had nearly melted him once before. Although its form had changed, the threat remained the same. Saul hadn't launched a direct frontal assault precisely to avoid alerting Gyudo and triggering his toxic defense. Even Saul found Gyudo's poison a troublesome foe. He promptly recalled his tendrils, leaving only Shadow bind behind to prevent escape. By then, Gyudo's companion had already collapsed to the ground in convulsions, a thin layer of frost spreading across his entire body. Saul looked up and finally saw the attacker in the sky. It was a man with snow-white hair and wings made of ice crystals slowly fanning behind his back. Two massive blue-white spell formations floated above his head and beneath his feet. These formations had completely masked his killing intent and magical presence before he struck. Now that the concealment was no longer needed, Saul clearly sensed the waves radiating from his body. This man was a second-rank wizard. A completely unfamiliar second-rank wizard, with none of the traits of those from the western regions. Could he be from another territory? Saul wondered. While Saul was still wary of this stranger and refrained from acting, Gyudo suddenly split into several identical clones and fled in 4 directions. One of them was headed straight for Saul and Captain Harry. But the second-rank wizard in the sky didn't plan to let Gyudo escape. Several white ice spears formed around him again. Trying to drag others down with him, Saul thought. He could dodge instantly, but Captain Harry behind him wouldn't survive. Saul stared at the incoming Gyudo clone. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he immediately noticed a few distortions in the figure's outline. That one's fake. Having confirmed it, Saul didn't try to intercept. A black tendril stretched from behind his neck and wrapped around Captain Harry's waist, flinging both of them to the side. The ice spears struck the fake Gyudo, piercing clean through his body and into the deck. The moment they hit, they exploded with a loud boom, turning into countless fine ice needles and scattering in all directions. A transparent soul armor spell instantly formed in front of Saul. Clatter! The spirit armor didn't last long. It shattered like glass under the barrage of dozens of ice needles. But the momentum of the ice needles had already weakened. They no longer carried the speed of the initial blast. The black tendrils split again, forming a wall in front of Saul. Thud, 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 thud. The ice needles embedded themselves into little Algae's clones, sinking in only halfway before their energy ran out. Little Algae's main body began to rattle, ka-ka-ka-ka, like a person drenched in freezing water. A second later, the clone broke apart, fracturing with visible cracks before shattering to pieces. Captain Harry, who had yet to fully register what had happened, suddenly lost the strength in his legs. If not for the tendril still holding him by the waist, he would have slumped to the floor. But worse was yet to come. The Gyudo clones fleeing in all directions turned out to be entirely fake. Every ice spear pierced through an illusion and detonated on the deck. Where once was an intact ship, now there were 4 gaping holes. The entire airship began to shudder. Lord Saul, Captain Harry, who had moments ago been frozen in fear, suddenly steadied himself. "Can you send me to the engine room? If this airship crashes at this altitude, no one but you will survive." Saul nodded and had little Algae toss him down the passage into the cabin. He, however, kept his eyes locked on the old man in the sky. At that moment, the elder's gaze turned to Saul as well. His eyes were like murky sewage, radiating a foul, chilling stench. "A third first-rank wizard," the white-haired elder sneered. "A tiny airship with 3 first-rank wizards aboard. Looks like you're with them. In that case, you can all die together." The killing intent he unleashed turned summer into winter. Saul's skin immediately erupted with goosebumps. All around, passengers who had not managed to flee in time instantly turned into ice sculptures, frozen solid. And in Saul's mind, the dark red diary began flipping pages with a whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Chapter 444, Jasim. Perhaps because a great battle was imminent, the words in the diary were brief. You charged forward. You died. You ran away. You died. As expected of a second-rank wizard, Saul seemed to stand no chance before him. Only now did he truly understand the despair felt by mentors like Ans when facing Gorsa. So this is what it's like among true wizards. Even a single rank's difference could mean such a vast gap in power. Looks like I'll have to use my final trump card. Saul put on a terrified expression, as if he was about to beg for mercy. But within his mouth, the miniature spell formation inscribed on his tongue had already begun to shimmer with light. To drag a second-rank wizard into the mental realm would likely end in mutual destruction. The diary hadn't issued another warning, which at the very least meant Saul could survive this way. The old man across from him seemed intrigued by the strange magic fluctuations around Saul, pausing his attack with interest. My purpose here is already achieved. You and that companion from earlier are both quite amusing. At long last, the Stat Continent has produced some decent magic. Yet just as the two were about to unleash their power, someone suddenly appeared at the cabin door, stumbling forward across the swaying deck. Lord Jassim, the one who came, was none other than Agu. He practically threw himself in front of Saul, not even bothering to stand up as he shouted loudly, "My master is the apprentice of the great Gorsa of the Glare family. Please, show mercy and don't harm an ally by mistake." Saul hadn't expected that Agu would actually know the other man. Even so, he didn't stop channeling the mental battlefield. "You're Gorsa's apprentice." The old man named Jassim suddenly lowered his head to glance at his own wrist. The movement looked eerily like someone checking a wristwatch in Saul's previous life. Saul sneaked a glance as well, but aside from white, bristling arm hair, he saw nothing unusual. However, when Jassim looked up again, there was now a trace of urgency in his eyes. "Fine, whether you're telling the truth or not, I'm out of time." As he spoke, two magic formations, one above his head and one beneath his feet, began to spin rapidly. The ice crystal wings on his back flapped gently, and in the next instant his figure blurred like an illusion and vanished above the airship. Sensing the magical fluctuations behind him, Saul immediately turned his head and saw the man already flying toward the horizon. He was far faster than Kira's giant bird. Whether or not this compared to Gorsa's teleportation was hard to say. After all, Gorsa's teleportation did seem to have a limited range. Once he confirmed that the enemy had completely disappeared from view, Saul finally let the magic gathering on his tongue fade. Though the airship was still swaying a bit, it no longer had that terrifying, near-crash instability from earlier. Agu was panting heavily, clearly still shaken. Saul, on the other hand, was doing relatively well. He'd experienced such horrifying situations many times before, and now that he had the mental battlefield, his ultimate weapon, he felt that even if he blew himself up, he could at least drag the enemy with him. "Who was Jassim?" Saul asked as he walked toward the man Jassim had just killed. "I'm not exactly sure either." Agu followed close behind, glancing nervously back as if afraid Jassim might return at any moment. "But years ago, he came looking for Tower Master Gorsa. The Tower Master accompanied him away for half a month before returning. He knows Master Gorsa, and he mentioned the Stat Continent. Could he be from the same continent as our master?" The man Jassim had killed was already covered in a thick layer of frost, though his posture was rather strange. Saul lowered his gaze and gave the corpse a kick. Beneath the body, a corroded round hole was revealed. Around the uneven edges were some scraps of fabric. Saul peered down through the hole. It led to a storage room. The floor there also showed signs of corrosion. Guido created 4 illusions to flee, but he himself took the chance to create a large hole and escape, then moved the corpse to cover it. Agu's attention shifted to this discovery, and his mood gradually settled. He looked down and analyzed Gyudo's actions as well, moving that quickly. It must have been a spell scroll. Agu hadn't been present during the battle, but just from Saul's description, he could piece together most of what had happened. Saul straightened up, his expression cold. Either way, we were interrupted by Jassim. Gyudo's definitely gone into hiding. This airship wasn't exactly huge, but not small either. With less than 100 people aboard, Saul could search it entirely if he wished. But with Gyudo on guard, things would be tricky. Especially since his entire body was toxic. Any one of his poisons could seriously injure Saul. Just then, the silver butterfly reappeared. "Brother Saul, I scattered phosphorus powder in Gyudo's dream. As long as he's not too far, I can track his movements." "Penny?" Saul was impressed. Ever since this nightmare butterfly absorbed enough veiled crystal essence, it had been displaying more and more abilities. "Where is Gyudo now?" "He's still on the ship, but he's probably set up lots of traps, so I can only sense a vague area." Saul stroked his chin. The ship's interior is cramped, hard to fight in, and if the airship actually gets destroyed, we'll lose all our luggage and Marsh. Marsh was the name of the mushroom coachman. But Saul couldn't just let Gyudo go either. "Agu, work with Penny to pinpoint Gyudo's location, but don't let him realize we found him." Both Penny and Agu immediately understood. Make Gyudo nervous, force him to leave the ship sooner. After that, Saul found Captain Harry, who was still calming the crew, and told him that the escaping wizard might still be hiding aboard. Harry's face turned grim. He both hoped Saul would find the man, and feared that he actually would. He didn't want someone that dangerous hiding on his ship, but if Saul did find him and another fight broke out, his airship might not survive it. In the end, Saul's search turned up nothing, and he declared that Gyudo had likely already left the ship. Harry breathed a sigh of relief. This was the best possible outcome. But seeing the faint displeasure on Saul's face, he wisely kept that thought to himself. With everyone on edge, the airship finally descended into Bluewater Bay. Agu and Marsh disembarked first with their luggage, while Saul followed at the rear, reluctantly scanning the surroundings with his mental power before finally departing. Then they boarded the carriage Captain Harry had arranged for them and headed toward Bluewater City. Just as the airship was about to take off again, a small shadow leapt from a window in one of the cabin doors. Gyudo held his hand over his mouth. After confirming that Saul's carriage had left, he immediately ducked into the airship's shadow and swallowed a few potions. His entire body suddenly swelled, transforming from a gaunt man into one tall and muscular. He rubbed his face and peeled off a mask-like layer of skin, which he quickly destroyed. His real face was still that hideous new tumor-covered one. But with a swipe of his hand, he gave himself yet another new face. At last, staring in the direction Saul had left, he clenched his teeth and headed toward the ocean. And at that moment, another figure jumped down from the side of the ship. It was Saul, dressed in a crew member's uniform. He turned and made a gesture to the anxious Captain Harry on the deck, then quickly took off in pursuit of Gyudo. Captain Harry finally let out a breath of relief. A crew member nervously asked, "Transporting wizards is just too terrifying. Captain, can we stop taking this route? Too many wizards come through. There have been several near fights already." Harry snapped back to himself and smacked the crewman's head. "If you don't want to make money, go back home and farm. If you can't handle this, you've got no business taking risks with me." Chapter 445, Tracking. Gyudo wasn't moving continuously. He would stop from time to observe whether there were any abnormal mental fluctuations within his visible range. At the same time, out of caution, he would leave poison behind at the places where he had paused. If someone tried to follow his trail, well, let them figure out how to detoxify themselves first. Of course, he couldn't keep using this method forever. After all, the poison he carried wasn't free or unlimited. But this trip to Blue Water Bay required extra caution. It was a place known to everyone in the Wizard Tower, and he could very well run into someone he knew. He even suspected that Saul had disembarked here precisely to head for Blue Water Bay. But even if there was a risk of running into Saul again, Gyuto had to go to the source of the soul tide. Only by producing more soul toxins could he have a shot at further advancement. That was why he had spent a fortune to sneak onto the airship, just to get here ahead of everyone else. What he hadn't expected was that Saul had also taken the airship and arrived this quickly. Even though there was still a danger of running into Saul on the way to Blue Water Bay, Gyuto felt it was a risk worth taking. Blue Water Bay is big. We might not cross paths. I'll just grab what I need and leave, head straight to Kaugust and get off the Stat Continent, Gyuto thought to himself, while once again scanning his surroundings with vigilance. He considered scattering some toxic agents again, but feared doing so might help someone lock onto his trail. Still uneasy, he checked the area again. Seeing no sign of anyone, Gyuto lowered his head and continued on his way. 10 minutes after he left, Saul, cloaked entirely in a deep brown robe, arrived at the spot where Gyuto had just rested. He didn't get too close, in case he triggered any traps the other had left behind. But it seemed Gyuto was more concerned about leaving traces than setting up traps. He hadn't left anything behind. He must have used a spell to mask his aura. If it weren't for Penny's phosphorus powder, I'd have lost his trail completely, Saul murmured. Brother Saul, that bad old man is rushing to the coast. Do you think there's a boat waiting for him there? Penny whispered in Saul's ear. You mean he came this way to escape? That's entirely possible. The Blue Water Bay Pier has been abandoned for a long time. If a boat comes quietly, it probably won't alert anyone. Then we need to pick up the pace. Saul's feet left the ground, and he suddenly soared into the sky. A layer of misty gray fog gradually enveloped his body, while his magical aura was carefully concealed by Penny. Saul didn't follow Gyuto's trail exactly. He flew as straight a line as possible, intending to cut him off, before Gyuto could rendezvous with any potential allies. But as he flew, Saul suddenly muttered, puzzled, "This place looks familiar." He looked toward a cliff ahead. There weren't many trees, and the path abruptly ended, as if sliced clean off by a giant blade. I've been here before. Below should be the beach where the shell pickers gather. It's still a fair distance from the dock, and the area is mostly shallow waters where boats can't approach. Gyuto seems to be headed down there, but what's he doing in a place like that? Saul dropped from midair, and the moment his feet touched the ground, he sprinted forward. Sensing that Gyuto was below the cliff and still far away, Saul wasn't too worried about being noticed, especially with the terrain advantage on his side. Once he silently reached the cliff's edge, he stopped abruptly. Casting a minor spell, he blended in with the surrounding rocks before cautiously poking his head out. It wasn't yet dusk, so the shell pickers hadn't gone down to the sea. The surroundings were eerily quiet, with only the wailing of the waves. Gyuto wasn't visible on the beach, but Penny told Saul that her phosphorus powder was moving across the sand. Invisibility. Saul stared in the direction Penny indicated and finally spotted a faint shimmer. No, probably just a form of camouflage magic, like an illusion. People can use magic to blur their presence, but ships can't. That kind of spell would consume too much magic and have obvious edges. Saul looked out over the sea. The waves were high, but within his view, there wasn't a single boat in the area. Although it was still a clear day, and the sky where Saul had just flown through was cloudless, this stretch of sea was covered by a thick, ominous overcast, as if the ocean itself were steeped in unresolved sorrow. Then Saul noticed Gyuto. He was diving into the water. He's heading underwater. Could someone be waiting for him down there? Penny asked, puzzled. Saul shook his head lightly. Or maybe he didn't come here to rendezvous with anyone. He then opened the diary in his mind. Lakai, what role did Guido play in your rebellion plan? He didn't seem to have any grudge against Master Gorsa, and during the final stages of the experiment, the mentor seemed to trust him more than anyone else. Of the only two who entered the triangular formation with Saul, Guido had received a remarkable amount of trust from Gorsa. Convincing Guido to cooperate took us years. We even promised that once the plan succeeded, part of Gorsa and some apprentices would be handed over to him for experimentation. Part of Gorsa? The higher a wizard's rank, the more valuable and powerful their body, soul, and locator are as materials. We wouldn't let that go to waste. Saul clicked his tongue. Gorsa had once coveted Saul's soul, and now it seemed Saul's body and soul were being eyed by others too. He had nearly been split into thirds. Saul asked again, and what about the gray matter, I mean blue water soul? How much does Guido know? Does he know its origin or formation conditions? Of course we wouldn't share that kind of vital information with him. Saul cut him off before all the words had finished appearing. But Guido is diving into the waters of Blue Water Bay. He likely knows where the raw material for Blue Water Soul comes from. That's not impossible. After Jiro and I discovered the place, we kept the location secret and deliberately triggered multiple soul tides to accumulate fragments of souls steeped in evil thoughts. Once we'd gathered enough of those evil thoughts, we loosened our grip on the site. Byron discovered Blue Water Soul not long after that, which suited me just fine. If even a diligent and honest apprentice like Byron vouched for Blue Water Soul's effects, it would have much more convincing power with Tower Master Gorsa. But technically, Guido only learned of Blue Water Soul's origin after that, and he didn't have the opportunity to leave the Wizard Tower. Saul stood at the edge of the cliff, shaking his head. Yes, technically, he shouldn't have had the chance to learn the exact location of the gray matter, but the fact that he came here specifically, I can't ignore that. With that, Saul stepped forward into the void and plummeted downward. But just as he was about to hit the ground, his descent suddenly slowed, and he floated gently to the earth, without even kicking up much dust. Featherfall, a 0-rank spell. But after Saul had become a true wizard, the spell's effect and finesse had reached an entirely new level. After his promotion, Saul's burst power and endurance with high-rank spells had grown immensely. As for low-rank spells, he now displayed unparalleled control. If a third-rank apprentice and a true wizard cast the same spell, the true wizard would always win. This was the qualitative transformation brought about by the integration of the locator into the mental body, and a leap in mental strength. Chapter 446, The Seafloor. After landing, Saul didn't hesitate. He immediately sprinted toward the ocean. By now, Guido had already entered the sea some time ago. Brother Saul, my sense of the phosphorus powder is being blocked by something. Could he have discovered us? Penny suddenly warned Saul. Saul kept moving without slowing down, pondering for a moment before replying, "No, it's not him. The one blocking your senses should be this sea." He was reminded of the glowing fragments of wraiths at the seabed. Back then, he had been surprised by the sheer number of soul fragments underwater, but only attributed it to the many people who had died here. Looking back now, he realized that there must have been wizards stirring the pot behind the scenes. Otherwise, the deaths of ordinary people alone wouldn't be enough to form so many wraiths. Normally, when ordinary people die, their souls dissipate quickly due to their weak mental force. But a wizard could seize that fleeting moment before a soul completely vanishes and forcibly turn it into a wraith. The wraith extraction formation Saul had discovered was capable of this as well. When Saul reached the coastline, he didn't dive in like Guido. Instead, he flew up directly above the sea. Gyudo had gone underwater from the start, using the fragments of wraiths in the sea to mask his presence, an extremely cautious approach. But Saul, choosing not to submerge, was using those same soul fragments to mask the aura of his pursuit. His chase was bold and undisguised. Even the shadow Saul cast on the water surface was a hazy blur. If someone looked up from below, they'd think it was just a big fish or a boat. This was Shadow Web, another zero-rank minor spell. The stronger Saul became, the easier it was for him to master lower-rank spells, zero and first-rank spells, so long as they were available for exchange at the registry. He had basically mastered them all. As for second and third-rank spells, he knew far fewer. In fact, for third-rank spells, he only had Shadow Bind and the offensive spell Flame Arrow, which he had begun studying after leaving the Wizard Tower. But most true wizards generally only mastered 2 or 3 third-rank spells. The higher the rank, the harder they were to exchange for. There were only 3 such spells available for trade in the Wizard Tower's registry, and Saul had naturally copied all of them before leaving. If he wanted to learn new spells in the future, his only options were to trade with other factions, or to find a complete set of lost spell notes somewhere. Both methods were difficult, but Saul had an advantage. He could learn directly from the consciousness within the pages. So, if he wanted to learn a particular kind of spell, he just needed to obtain the soul of a wizard who had specialized in that element. Ordinary wizards had no way to obtain such clear and complete souls. Of course, for a consciousness to completely dictate the rune structure of a high-rank spell, the soul energy required was massive. Without Saul replenishing it, the consciousness could fade away before even finishing the explanation. Saul channeled his magic, accelerating over the sea with increasing speed, paying no mind to Gyudo's exact position below. "Lakai, just tell me where the source of the soul tide lies beneath the sea." Saul didn't plan to follow Gyudo this time. Someone sneaking around like Gyudo surely wasn't doing it for a few drifting soul fragments. He would definitely head for the place with the highest concentration of souls. The origin of the soul tide. Though reluctant, Lakai gave a very clear answer. Now the energy within Lakai's page was nearly spent and about to fade. No matter how powerful he had been, he was still just a second-rank apprentice. Suppressing his power meant limited mental strength. Even as a soul page, he wouldn't last much longer. Relying on Lakai's description, Saul quickly locked onto the location using flight. He discovered that it was very close to the water where he and Byron had first found the gray substance. Splash! Without hesitation, Saul plunged into the water. This spot was farther from shore, and even the dark clouds overhead had begun to thin. Had Lakai not pointed it out, Saul never would have imagined that a place where the environment was beginning to return to normal could be the source of the soul tide. But as he descended into the water, he found that only the surface layer was clear. Near the bottom, the waters were even murkier than the clouds above. Aside from the growing darkness, Saul couldn't find a single soul fragment. Yet although Lakai liked to lie, the diary compelled him to tell the truth. Saul didn't hesitate and continued to descend. He carefully surveyed his surroundings, but still found no sign of Gyudo. Since Gyudo had traveled underwater and didn't specialize in water element spells, his speed would be much slower than Saul's aerial flight. Saul kept descending until his hands finally touched the seafloor. Even this place is clean. Though there are a few wraith fragments, they're clearly fewer than around the shipwreck, and they don't glow either. Saul began feeling around the ground, carefully turning over seaweed and rocks. "Brother Saul, I can sense my phosphorus powder again. Gyudo's probably close," Penny suddenly warned him. Saul didn't respond. His right hand trembled, suddenly recoiling as if shocked. This is it. He had confirmed the location of a hidden cave. The entrance was narrow, wedged between rocks and covered by seaweed and dust. If Saul hadn't been this meticulous in his search, it would have been nearly impossible to find. A faint smile crept to Saul's lips as he slowly turned to face the direction Guido was approaching from. Well, about 5 minutes later, Guido finally arrived at this part of the seabed. With something like a fish bladder clenched in his mouth, he looked around in confusion before mimicking Saul and began turning over the seafloor in search. Clearly unfamiliar with the layout, Guido even had to resurface for air at one point. That fish bladder-like sac could actively absorb and compress external air, allowing Guido to stay underwater for such a long time. After catching his breath, Guido returned to searching the seabed. At last, he too found the cave on the sea floor. It looked so narrow that only a child could squeeze through, but upon discovery, Guido began forcing his way in. His muscles compressed little by little, and his body reverted to a skinny, bony form. Though a tight fit, he managed to slip in headfirst. After crawling forward several meters while scraping against the reef, the space suddenly opened up. The narrow tunnel gave way to a cavern where one could stretch out their arms freely. Packed inside were dense, countless soul fragments. These fragments didn't glow, but the evil thoughts they radiated were far more intense. As soon as Guido passed through the tight tunnel and entered the cavern, it felt like he'd pierced through a barrier. His mind was instantly bombarded by howling and wailing. There are so many wraith fragments here. It took him several seconds to recover his senses. He wasn't specialized in either light or dark element magic. Even as a true wizard, he still felt immense discomfort facing such an overwhelming concentration of wraith fragments. I need to act quickly. Looks like another wave of soul tide is about to erupt. Guido continued descending. The sheer density of soul fragments was beginning to affect physical matter. His vision was becoming obscured. A grayish haze filled the space, pierced intermittently by distorted screams. Mutilated and warped facial features frequently appeared before Guido, only to be swept away by the deep-sea currents. He didn't dare look too closely at the wraiths. Eyes narrowed, he focused entirely on descending further, avoiding further mental harm. A century ago, the Battle of Bluewater Bay had buried many true wizards as well. At last, Guido reached the bottom of the cavern. There were still more tunnels branching downward, leading deeper into the dark abyss, but Guido didn't continue. Relying on his mental strength, he barely managed to lock onto a specific spot. Brushing away slimy seaweed with both hands, he felt a rough and uneven surface. A trace of a smile finally appeared on his face. Found it. Chapter 447, Siphoning. As Guido touched the magic formation carved into the stone, the tip of his finger immediately began to glow faintly. The surge of magic startled the wraiths above his head, and their wails grew louder. The mental pressure on Guido grew heavier as well. His face turned pale, clearly in pain, but his movements didn't pause for a second. On the formation he had found, he began drawing a unique and complex rune. Clicking. The stone with the carved formation suddenly split apart to either side. Beneath the stone, a black goblet was revealed. The black goblet emitted a gentle and warm white light, instantly illuminating the small underwater cavern. Whoosh! Before Guido could even get a clear look at his surroundings, the seawater inside the stone cavern began to churn violently. The fragments of wraiths that had been drifting aimlessly were now rushing straight toward him, or rather, toward the black goblet. In that instant, Guido came to deeply understand what it meant to be flooded with souls. His face twisted in agony, and his teeth clenched tight. Scarlet blood seeped out between his teeth. Yet no matter how agonizing his body felt, Guido unwaveringly reached toward the black goblet. The murky fragments of souls pressed against him from all directions, blinding his vision. But while they could block his sight, they could not stop his hands. At last, Gyudo touched the stem of the goblet. Enduring the pain, he switched from feeling to gripping it in excitement. But the moment he grasped it, he realized something had changed in the sensation against his palm. What he felt was somewhat soft, and under the force of his motion, it squelched into his hand. The swirling storm of wraith fragments before his eyes suddenly scattered like frightened birds, revealing a face that made Gyudo's heart clench in terror. So, Gyudo could no longer care that he was underwater. He opened his mouth and shouted, and streams of bubbles rushed upward from his lips. The face that appeared before him was pale and bluish, not like the living. It was faintly translucent. And beneath that face, instead of a torso, were thick, twisted octopus-like tentacles. The suckers on the tentacles opened into mouths, each lined with sharp, gleaming teeth, surging toward Gyudo from all directions. In that moment, countless thoughts flashed through Gyudo's mind, but in the end, only one remained. Soul poison. Facing this bizarre version of Saul, Gyudo felt an overwhelming sense of danger. Only the soul poison crafted specifically against Saul gave him a sliver of reassurance. Even though the poison released under such conditions might harm him as well. But there was no more time to hesitate. Gritting his teeth, Gyudo surged magic into his arms. Bang! Twin bursts of blood bloomed in the water, instantly making the sea murky once more. The numbing soul poison quickly spread from his arms to his torso. And then, Gyudo's arms detached from his body like the limbs of a marionette. Before the wounds could even spurt much blood, new skin rapidly began to grow. By severing his arms, Gyudo had done everything he could to minimize the chance of infecting himself with the soul poison. But he was certain that Saul's strange skin would not be so lucky. Yet when the pain subsided and he came back to his senses, he was horrified to find that the tentacles had already wrapped around his face and torso. The gaping mouths on the suckers grinned wickedly, and the moment Gyudo opened his eyes, they bit into his face. Agonizing pain racked his body. After the torment of torn flesh came a far more terrifying sensation, the feeling of being drained. Gyudo felt as if he had become a thick soup in a colander, powerless as he seeped out in every direction. Impossible. Gyudo felt as though even his eyeballs were melting, being sucked into a strange space. He saw a narrow and eerie gray passageway. All around him, soul fragments flickered like fireflies. They were being swept forward along tunnel-like channels, occasionally squeezed from both sides by the narrowing walls. His form grew more viscous, fragmented, easier to digest. So this is what it feels like to be eaten. Gyudo's last remnants of consciousness drifted in confusion. But why is Saul unharmed, and even able to kill me? Outside, Saul, transformed into a monstrous octopus-like soul form, slowly released Gyudo. The latter had become a corpse. Though his body bore not a single wound, it radiated a fragile, on the verge of shattering aura. Saul himself was in a state of mental disarray. Just moments ago, in order to reel in Gyudo's soul quickly, he had absorbed it at full force. But Gyudo had been surrounded by a large number of soul fragments. As a result, in absorbing Gyudo's soul, Saul had also inhaled vast quantities of those fragments. And within those fragments, the evil thoughts were so concentrated it nearly took physical form. Thus, even Saul was momentarily paralyzed after taking in such dense hatred. Countless evil thoughts surged into his soul through every pore. The larger, more intact fragments were crushed as they passed through, ground like jelly through his throat and mouth. At the same time, Saul began seeing broken, flickering images, each one a soul's most desperate obsession. But ever since his promotion, Saul's mental strength had grown far more solid than before. He did not become lost as he once might have. It was like watching a choppy, chaotic short film, and then it was over. Still, within that flood of fragments, he once again glimpsed a thread connecting all the scenes. This time, however, he made no attempt to pull it. The more one knows, the deeper the reverence for the unknown. Saul could faintly sense it now. If he touched that thread, something far more terrifying than evil thoughts might latch onto him. But while Saul watched his personal horror film, Guido's soul poison was also spreading through his soul form. But what Guido hadn't accounted for was that Saul was currently completely out of his physical body. The flesh that the poison was meant to target wasn't even present. Back when he'd been poisoned at the Wizard Tower, Saul had wondered whether he could suck toxins from his own skin by drawing out his soul. That experiment had been interrupted. This time, he directly used his soul form to bear the brunt of Guido's poison. And the diary gave no warning. As soon as the poison began invading his soul, Saul heard the sound of pages rustling in his mind. Almost instantly, the poison aimed at his soul was completely absorbed. By the time he regained full awareness, the detoxification process had already finished. It was so fast, so thorough, it was as if he had never been poisoned at all. Just as I thought, with the diary's ability to absorb evil thoughts, soul-based toxins are no threat to my soul form. That also explains why the diary didn't give a warning last time Guido poisoned me, because the poison wouldn't kill me. Once it reached my soul, the diary would just cleanse it. But if I had failed to help Master Gorsa because of it, I would have been removed by others after his death. Saul nodded. He finally understood what had happened back then. All the evil thoughts had now been consumed. That jelly-like sensation of being sucked through his skin slowly faded. Saul shuddered, and dozens of tentacles drifting in the seawater gradually fused back into the form of a human. Seems like this soul poison is essentially a form of evil thought, perfectly countered by the diary. Once he confirmed Guido was truly dead, Saul cast his gaze once more toward the black goblet wedged between the rocks. He was still in soul form, unable to carry physical objects, so he swiftly exited the sea cave. 10 minutes later, after returning to his body, Saul re-entered the cave. By then, the previously exposed goblet had once again vanished beneath the rock. The spell formation concealing the item was surprisingly advanced. Leave it unused for a while, and it automatically seals itself. Although the goblet was sealed again, Saul was in no hurry. He opened the black diary inside his soul and turned to the 6th black page. How do I unseal it? Find the 3rd node on the rune and draw the deformed oceanic rune along the markings. The black page that had belonged to Guido gave Saul the answer. Following Guido's instructions, Saul easily reopened the seal and once more laid eyes on the softly glowing black goblet. But he didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he focused his attention on the black diary page that once belonged to Guido. So convenient, the power of the diary's black pages, it's far too tempting for corruption. Chapter 448, Human-Faced Fish. If you want something, just kill for it. No, that's not right. Saul shut his eyes, suppressing the sudden surge of murderous desire from within. He casually stowed the goblet into his compression bag and immediately turned to swim upward. Just as Saul left the narrow, underwater cave, the seabed beneath his feet suddenly began to quake violently. The few remaining fish in the sea abruptly began to swim in a frenzy. No, swim wasn't even the right word. They were treating the ground as if it were water, launching themselves like arrows from a bow, slamming headfirst into the seafloor. Thud, 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 thud. In the turbulent ocean, Saul didn't hear a sound. But when he saw those fish heads turning into a bloody pulp, his mind filled in the sound of brutal impacts all on its own. That imagined sound, fused with the pounding of his own heart, made his blood boil. Could this be because I took the goblet? But now, putting it back wasn't even an option. The seaquakes had crushed the already narrow tunnel into a pile of ruins. Without hesitation, Saul surged upward as fast as he could. He had barely swum a few meters when columns of gray-white gas suddenly erupted from the water behind him. These columns slowed down due to underwater resistance, allowing Saul to get a clear look at what they really were. They were fish, gray-white fish, each with a human face. Unlike the mermaids of fairy tales, who had human torsos, these creatures had only a human face. The rest of their body was purely fish. Because the face grew on the head of the fish, it was split down the nose, folding outwards to either side. Each human eye was positioned on either side of the fish's head. More and more gas columns erupted from the seafloor, accompanied by frothing bubbles, turning the water murkier and murkier. Saul had no choice but to cast soul armor to avoid being struck by the gas columns. On instinct alone, he wanted nothing to do with those human-faced fish. Even with soul armor active, the barrage of gas columns slammed into it, shoving Saul violently toward the surface. With clouds of bubbles and swirling sediment, he tumbled upward through the water. In an extremely short span of time, he burst through to the surface. His insides churned like he was about to vomit blood. Saul had to cast a basic healing spell just to stabilize himself. But just as he finally steadied himself at the water's surface, he looked around and was horrified to see one grotesque, folded human face after another. The only silver lining was that none of the faces were paying him any attention. They stared at the sky, at the sun, at the clouds, the wind, the distant land. Their expressions were rapturous, intoxicated by it all as they took deep breaths, mesmerized. They struggled to raise their upper bodies from the water, as if desperate to break free from the sea's hold. But to Saul, this act of enjoying the air, of savoring each breath, was no different from the rhythmic opening and closing of gills. Their gills were crimson, streaked with threads of blood. They were still fish, not human. The remnants of soul-bound obsession clung to their forms. As people, they had feared the ocean, yearned for the air. Saul had no intention of soaking in seawater alongside these human-faced fish. After healing himself, he immediately cast flight, soaring into the air. From high above, the scene below was even more grand and more grotesque. It was then that Saul suddenly noticed one of the fish bearing a golden hairclip on its scaly body. He recognized that hairclip. After a moment of searching his memory, he confirmed it. That's Mido's hairclip, Sanders' sister. At this moment, the distorted girl's face was also enjoying the air with blood all over her body. But she didn't know that for her. The air out of the sea water was like the moon in the water, and being obsessed with it would only drown her. Including Mido, these souls that had perished in the soul tide had been suppressed beneath the sea for years. Their souls were no longer intact. Most of their fragments had been steeped in thick, violent, evil thoughts, gathering in the confined, narrow depths. Saul believed that the soul tide was born from the eruption of that accumulated evil thoughts. A yearning for freedom, a hunger for life had driven them to seek the land once more. But because a portion of the main souls were still trapped at the seafloor, the soul tide that had transformed into the tide would inevitably rise and fall, eventually returning to the deep, back to the sides of these faces. Just like how Morden, back at Hanging Hands Valley, even after becoming a wraith, still wanted to recover the other half of his soul body. Recalling Sanders' letter, how he had lingered in Blue Water Town, he was probably searching for his sister's soul body. Saul hesitated for a moment, then flew over and collected the fish with Mido's face. He raised his hand to conjure a water sphere and placed the fish with Mido's face at its center. The moment it was trapped inside, Mido immediately panicked. Like a person about to drown, she began struggling frantically. Her head slammed repeatedly against the water sphere's edges, trying to force her way out. Saul frowned deeply. "Mido," he shouted sharply. And surprisingly, the fish instantly turned around, aiming its sharp face at him. Its mouth opened and closed, revealing rows of tiny, dense, and razor-sharp teeth. "You can actually understand your own name." Saul held the water sphere in one hand and rubbed his chin with the other. "Stay still there. I'll take you to see your brother Sander." Saul was merely trying it out, but unexpectedly, Mido really did seem to understand. She immediately dove into the center of the water sphere, enduring the pain of near suffocation, but no longer tried to surface. If one ignored the distorted face and the silver fish tail behind it, the look in her eyes actually seemed pure. Now that she had calmed, Saul turned his gaze back to the other fish beneath him. In truth, every one of these human-faced fish likely had someone out there who once cared for them. But regrettably, Saul couldn't possibly take all of them, nor could he search the world for their living relatives. The nearby fish turned their heads one after another when they saw Saul take in Mido. They too seemed to understand Saul's words. Within their fish eyes, there appeared expressions of comfort and joy. These fragments of souls, suppressed at the seafloor and attached to fish bodies, carried not a trace of evil. "Return to the deep," Saul said gently, his voice echoing in the ears of every fish. "The surface is no longer a place where you can survive." Even he could not save so many shattered souls, and the power within these pure souls wasn't enough to sustain their existence for long. Once the sealing force was undone, they would break apart further and vanish from this world. But if they returned to the depths, they might be able to linger just a little longer. However, all the nearby fish shook their heads at Saul in unison, then once again began to struggle at the surface like drowning people. At that moment, a sudden thunderclap roared through the sky. Huge raindrops started pouring down. "This rain is wrong." Saul immediately cast soul armor to shield himself and Mido. The very next second, he felt the rain corroding the magic on his armor. Saul had no choice but to continuously pour magic into the spell to maintain it. At the same time, raindrops hit the sea surface, splashing onto the human-faced fish. Instantly, hissing white steam rose from their bodies. The human faces and fish flesh were being simultaneously corroded by the rain, exposing wide, gruesome wounds. And yet, disturbingly, these fish wore expressions of ecstasy and rapture as they were melted away. The rain came hard and fast, but within a single minute it stopped. By then, the entire surface of the sea was covered in pale white bones. The blood of countless fish had dyed this section of ocean a deep red. Just then, from the waters surrounding Saul, within dozens of meters, streams of pure white soul fragments suddenly rose and floated toward him, but they were blocked by his soul armor. A thought flashed through Saul's mind. He canceled the armor, and the fragments of pure, untainted souls flowed into his body one by one, bringing with them soul power that was pristine, strong, and free from even the slightest impurity. Power that didn't require the dead wizard's diary to purify. He could use it fully, just as it was. Chapter 449, The Shattered Goblet. After the rain stopped, the heavy clouds that had lingered above the Bluewater Bay for who knows how many years gradually began to disperse. A ray of sunlight broke through, casting its glow upon the sea's surface. The once deep and somber waters now carried a hint of warmth under the sun's light. If one ignored the swathes of fish bones floating on the surface, it would almost resemble a beautiful and serene painting. Just like this seemingly splendid world of wizards, beneath its surface lay untold numbers of buried, pitiful lives. Saul took one last look over the sea, then turned and flew back toward the shore. As soon as he landed, he spotted Agu standing atop the cliff. Before entering the sea, Saul had left a mark there to help Agu find him more easily on his return. "Master, are you all right?" Agu leapt down from the carriage, looking at Saul with concern. Though he knew that in terms of sheer power, Gyudo was no match for Saul. Still, Gyudo possessed soul toxins that could counter Saul's skin, and the man was sly and full of schemes. Who knew what kind of tricks he might have used? Behind Agu, Marsh, the coachman, looked over as well, the mushroom on his head bouncing up and down, as if trying to crane its neck to get a better view. "I'm fine," Saul tapped his temple lightly. Agu immediately understood. It seemed the 6th page of the diary had found its new master. Though how long the 5th and 6th pages would hold out, that remained uncertain. Voices drifted up from the foot of the hill. Saul walked back to the cliff's edge and glanced sideways. Though it wasn't yet dusk, some shell pickers had already arrived in preparation. But now each of them stood there on the shore, tools in hand, staring dumbfounded at the horizon. The thick, oppressive clouds that had shrouded that part of the sky for years had mostly dispersed. Beams of sunlight pierced through the gaps in the clouds, shining down. Dazzling, beautiful. Breathtaking. Then suddenly, a middle-aged woman collapsed to the ground, slapping her thighs and wailing. "The shells, there'll be no more." Startled from their stupor, the other fishers began to understand. Now that the sea had returned to normal, those strange conch shells, reliant on eerie powers to survive, would soon dwindle and eventually vanish. Crying broke out all at once. A few, however, did not weep, including a small, thin boy. He stared blankly at the sea, biting down hard on his lip. After a moment, he tossed aside the hemp rope in his hand and turned to run back the way he came. Seeing this, Saul's lips curled into a smile. That boy was Banbu, the shell picker he had once saved in Bluewater Bay. It seemed Banbu had figured things out. Though the vanishing of the strange conches would take away their current livelihood, the restored sea meant that Bluewater Bay might soon thrive once again. The small town that had been forced to relocate to the desert could very well return. And with that return would come more jobs, safer ones. It would all depend on whether he could seize the opportunity. Those who sat on the ground wailing, slapping their thighs, probably understood this too, yet they still chose to cry first. Having seen enough, Saul handed the water sphere in his hand to Agu, then turned and climbed back into the carriage. "To Bluewater City," he ordered. As Agu carefully held the water sphere and got into the carriage as well, Marsh flicked the reins, skillfully turning the carriage around and speeding off toward the distance. Though Marsh's driving skills were excellent, the roads, untouched for years, were still somewhat bumpy. Traveling alone far from home, it wasn't ideal to keep the shock-absorbing magic formation active at all times. A bit too extravagant. Inside the carriage, Saul took out the black goblet he had just obtained. "Agu, have you seen this before?" Saul was just about to explain the origin of the goblet when he saw Agu suddenly leap from his seat. "Master, how did you come by the shattered goblet?" "The shattered goblet," Saul repeated. The name itself sounded anything but ordinary. He looked toward the diary, and only then noticed new text had already appeared. He had been too absorbed in the sea's spectacle to realize it earlier. Lunar calendar, year 317, June 6th, clear skies. You followed a greedy little devil and discovered a goblet that holds evil thoughts. Infuse it with the strongest soul, and it brews the bitterest nectar. Infuse it with the most souls, and it brews the sourest draught. If you poured yourself in, what kind of drink would you become? Based on the diary's words, this shattered goblet could transform the collected soul entities into something else. What would it become? Saul peered into the goblet, only for Agu to hastily cover the rim with his hand. "Master, you must not look into the goblet's interior casually." Agu's expression was solemn. Saul, never one to ignore sound advice, immediately placed the goblet into a perfectly sized wooden box and shut the lid tightly. Seeing this, Agu let out a sigh of relief. Master, the shattered goblet is rare on the continent of Stat, but in Nefrit, every major wizarding power has one. Oh, something that makes you so nervous is common in another continent. Saul was genuinely curious. Especially that last line in the diary. It was hard not to make associations. It's because Nefrit's cultural customs are different from ours. As he mentioned the other continent, Agu's expression grew complex. They place great importance on death. Oh, half of Saul's attention remained on the diary. But it offered no further response. What do you mean, funerals, offerings? Not quite. The dominant belief there is that all things must ultimately die. Unless something surpasses absolute limits, everything should perish at its destined time. For lingering soul entities that should not exist, they typically use the shattered goblet to recycle and destroy them. Saul couldn't help but scoff. You're sure this is a mainstream belief, and not just some powerful death-obsessed faction controlling public thought? Agu gave a bitter smile. I've never been there myself, just heard tales from wizards who fled from that continent. At the time, Nefrit was governed by 5 major wizarding factions or families. They jointly created a law, the Law of Life's Limit. Though to be fair, the upper limit was quite high. Agu explained, apparently, it was mainly to prevent wizards or extraordinary beings from using extreme or corrupt methods to avoid death. They believed such forbidden lives would destroy the world and had to be returned to death. If that's the case, I can understand it to an extent, cleansing twisted wizards or pollutants to preserve the safety of their world. I think so too, Agu nodded. Then suddenly his face changed, as if remembering something. I heard, one of their treaties strictly forbids the resurrection of wizards below 3rd rank. Saul immediately sat upright. So, could it be that Guido is from Nefrit? That he stopped Master Gorsa not because of anything else, but simply because he didn't want Lady Yura, who was only 2nd rank in life, to be resurrected? Then Saul laughed, and here I am saying only 2nd rank as if that's nothing. Agu considered it. Your guess is very plausible. Saul looked down at the wooden box in his hand that held the shattered goblet, his mind returning to the diary's words. Greedy little devil, even if Guido betrayed Master Gorsa to stop the resurrection, he's not the mastermind. Otherwise, the diary wouldn't call him greedy or a little devil. There's someone behind Guido. They are the true owner of the shattered goblet. At that thought, Saul immediately said to Agu and Marsh, what happened today in Bluewater Bay, tell no one. Yes, master, Agu immediately obeyed. Sir, we went straight to Bluewater City after disembarking from the airship. Everyone knows that. Marsh called out from outside. Saul nodded, then tucked the shattered goblet into his compressed satchel, leaned back and closed his eyes to rest. Did Master Gorsa know about Nefrit's customs? Did he simply not care? Or had he never expected that they would extend their influence to other continents? But within Saul's mental realm, the diary had already turned to Guido's black page. Chapter 450, Blue Water City. Blue Water City. A very strange city. It seemed wealthy. Some of the buildings in the city could even rival those in the capital of the Kema Duchy. Yet it also seemed poor. Most of the luxurious villas stood empty, uninhabited. Meanwhile, just across a single street, the slums were packed to the brim with people. Judging purely by its economic income, it wouldn't even be a stretch to downgrade it to a town. But as a port city with once brilliant historical and cultural heritage, its city lord would rather maintain the current tax level for a full-fledged city than give up the social standing that came with the title. And it wasn't just the city lord. There remained a group of once wealthy individuals who, despite having the means to move elsewhere, still stubbornly clung to this place. Yet those living in three-story houses with large gardens might have emptier pockets than the poor folk in thatched huts. City Lord Macon was once again enjoying a leisurely afternoon tea in the garden with his wizard friend. That friend, while called a wizard, was in fact only a second-rank apprentice. He knew only a few spells, so few, in fact, that one might suspect he'd been expelled from some wizarding organization. The second-rank apprentice's name was Karen. He was already over 40 and lived each day nervously and cautiously. Even City Lord Macon found it difficult to persuade him to come out. But since he had come out today, it was a rare opportunity to strengthen their bond. After all, Karen was the last wizard willing to reside in Blue Water City for the long term. Macon picked up his white porcelain teacup and took a sip, looking both content and slightly ingratiating as he turned to Karen. "You've locked yourself in your room for half a month already. The Shallowater roses are blooming. If you don't come out soon, you'll miss their flowering season." Karen said nothing. He picked up his empty teacup and poured in a solution he'd brought with him. "I'll be going out soon." Macon was stunned and immediately asked, "Where are you going, and for how long?" Karen muttered, "I ran out of a critical material for my experiment. I need to go to the coast to gather more. By the way, how's the harvesting of the Blackwater snails coming along? I need 1,000 of them." Macon's mouth twitched. The Blackwater snail was one of the few products they still made any money on, and yet here was Wizard Karen asking for 1,000 right off the bat. But there was no helping it. If they wanted him to stay, they had to offer something of value. "I'll have the steward count them up right away." Karen nodded. "Then make it quick, I'm heading out tomorrow." Karen usually went out once or twice a year. Sometimes he'd return in 3 days, sometimes it took half a month. But each time he left, Lord Macon would get nervous, afraid the man might leave and never come back. Having a wizard in the city, even just a second-rank apprentice, meant a lot. He could solve problems no ordinary person could, and without a wizard, what difference was there between a city and a village? While Lord Macon was considering whether to buy something to strengthen Karen's attachment to Blue Water City, the steward came hurrying in and gave a deep bow from a distance, a sign of urgent news. Karen, seated across from Macon, also noticed and with practiced ease picked up his porcelain cup, took a gentle sip of his unknown liquid and stood up. "I'll leave you to it. I'm heading back." Lord Macon was disappointed. Their conversation had been too short, but he knew the steward wouldn't dare interrupt unless it was truly important. "What's the matter?" Macon asked before Karen had even exited the garden, signaling his trust in the man. "The gate guard sent a message. A wizard has entered Blue Water City." "Oh," the city lord immediately stood up. Even Karen, who had been walking away, paused mid-step. The guard tried to charge him an entry tax. City Lord Macon nearly jumped out of his skin. "He what?" The steward quickly explained. As soon as he saw that the coachman had a white mushroom moving on his head, he returned the money right away. Even the coachman had something that bizarre going on. Whoever was inside the carriage must surely be a wizard. "What kind of mushroom was it?" Karen returned to the garden. "They say it looked like a very ordinary whitecap mushroom, with a slightly gray tint to the umbrella," the steward quickly replied, bowing again. "A whitecap mushroom," Karen murmured deep in thought. "Where is that wizard headed? Do we know why he came?" "He asked the guards for an address. Seems like he headed there directly." Before either the city lord or Wizard Karen could ask, the steward supplied it. It was 16C Shrimp Street. That area is mostly home to poor locals and out-of-towners. I've already sent someone to investigate who lives there now. The city lord nodded, tension visible in his face. "Have them follow discreetly. Don't let him feel disrespected." Then he looked at Karen. "Wizard, should we invite him for tea?" Karen thought for a moment and asked the steward, did that carriage have any distinguishing marks? But before the steward could answer, he waved it off himself. Forget it. What would you lot even notice? Go extend a respectful invitation to the wizard, but if he refuses, don't press him. He's at least a third-rank apprentice. Hiss, the steward sucked in a cold breath. City Lord Macon wanted to react the same way, but he held it in. What? At that moment, Saul, the one being discussed by Blue Water City's Lord and resident wizard, had already arrived at 16C Shrimp Street by carriage. He had, of course, noticed the people trailing his carriage at a distance, but he paid them no mind. When the carriage stopped out front, the passing pedestrians all craned their necks to look. A double-decker carriage like that could only be owned by someone quite wealthy. But when they saw the mushroom wriggling atop the coachman's head, their expressions turned to horror, and they quickly fled the alley. Agu jumped off the carriage and walked up to knock on the door. Before he could knock a third time, there came the sound of hurried footsteps from inside. A few breaths later, the door flew open, revealing a familiar face. Who are you looking for? Sander looked both nervous and excited. When he saw Agu, his expression turned to shock. Just then, Saul stepped down from the carriage and said sideways to Sander, "Let's talk inside." Sander's face lit up with joy the moment he saw Saul. "My lord, you're here. Please come in." Saul nodded and stepped through the doorway. Number 16C Shrimp Street had a small courtyard. It looked like it had been partitioned off from another property with a wall. Saul's carriage couldn't fit in the courtyard, so it remained outside. The coachman stayed with it, while Agu followed Saul into the yard. They passed through the narrow courtyard and entered a modest two-room house made of wood and stone. Once inside, Sander closed the door, and the room plunged into darkness. He fumbled around, about to light an oil lamp, when a gentle glow lit up the ceiling, illuminating the entire space. Agu stepped forward, holding a water sphere the size of a human head in both hands. Strangely, Sander hadn't noticed Agu carrying anything until just now. Inside the translucent, slightly shimmering sphere swam a terrifying little fish with a human face. Yikes! Sander jumped at the sight, especially when the little fish seemed to notice him too and popped out half of its face from the sphere with a plop. Although the fish quickly retreated, Sander was so startled he nearly fell over. Agu tilted his chin. "What's wrong? Don't recognize it." He then casually tossed the water sphere into Sander's arms. It hit his chest and rolled down along his clothes. Sander instinctively reached out and caught it. His clothes were only slightly dampened, but the sphere felt icy cold in his hands. The human-faced fish emerged again, this time spitting a stream of clear water at Sander. Sander stared closely at it, the fear on his face slowly giving way to astonishment. Mido. Chapter 451, Turning into a Fish. Sander stared blankly at the little fish, flopping around inside the water orb. All right, the longer he looked, the cuter it seemed. Saul walked over as well, lowered his head to look at the unusually lively little fish, and smiled. "She still remembers you. She gets really excited when she sees her big brother." Sander's throat bobbed. Suddenly, he turned and carried the water orb into the bedroom. Saul heard a series of clattering and banging sounds from within. Then, Sander ran back out, one hand clutching the water orb, the other dragging his massive, heavy suitcase. The suitcase was nearly flung into the air as he yanked it out, and when it crashed onto the ground, one of the wheels at the bottom snapped off and rolled into some unknown corner. Sander paid no mind to the damage. He immediately laid the suitcase flat, hands trembling as he opened the lock. The lid sprang open, revealing a girl with tousled hair lying inside. Sander lowered the hand holding the water orb, bringing it closer to the girl's body. "Come back, Mido." But the fish with the human face showed no reaction, continuing to happily swim about in the orb, occasionally poking its little head out. "Come back, Mido. This is your body," Sandor said, now a little anxious. "You might be misunderstanding something," Saul said from the side. "Mido is already dead. A dead person's soul can't return to their body. The only reason she's surviving in this bizarre form now is because of some special power. That power supply has been cut off, and the remaining energy will only last her a short while longer." Sandor looked up in a daze, lips trembling. "But look, Mido's body is still intact. In the legends, isn't it said that if you retrieve the soul, it can return to its original body?" "You said it yourself. It's a legend," Agu couldn't help but chime in. "To ordinary people, the soul of the living and the soul of the dead are two different things. The moment she died, her soul had already become damaged and corrupted. Even if you forced a revival, what comes back might not be the same person. It's better to cherish the little time you have left." Agu looked at the eerily human-faced fish, a trace of melancholy in his eyes. "Huh?" Saul suddenly noticed something and crouched down, reaching out to touch Mido's original body. "There's some kind of magic sustaining her body, keeping it from decaying, but that force is starting to weaken now." His gaze shifted to the golden hairpin in Mido's hair. "Is the energy in this hairpin about to run out?" As soon as Saul spoke, both Sandor and Agu's eyes shifted to the hairpin on the girl's head. Then, in a flash, the golden hairpin turned into a streak of light and shot into the forehead of the human-faced fish. In the next instant, the girl's body, now devoid of the golden hairpin, turned into a dull pile of bones. "Mido!" Sandor cried out as his sister's corpse vanished before his eyes. All these years, her perfectly preserved body had been his emotional anchor. Now, seeing it turn to bone in an instant left him devastated. But the next second, the little fish in Sandor's hands leapt forcefully, completely escaping from the water orb. It twisted midair, then whipped its tail squarely onto the tip of Sandor's nose. Sandor froze. His rising grief got awkwardly stuck halfway. Saul chuckled. "She's telling you she's here, not there." Then, Sandor hesitated for a while, then suddenly slumped his shoulders and let out a small sigh as his expression relaxed. "That's fine, too." Then he looked up at Saul with a serious expression. "Should I be buying a fish tank or something? What does Mido eat? Can she have cake or fruit?" Saul's face also turned serious. Originally, Mido's residual soul attached to the fish didn't need to eat. The fish eating wouldn't provide any energy for Mido in her current spirit form. She wouldn't survive long. Even on the lowest energy consumption, she'd last at most 7 or 8 days. But after the golden hairpin merged into the fish's body, Mido's unstable soul seemed to stabilize quite a bit. The enchantment structure inside this golden hairpin is even more complex than I thought. Currently, the magic from the hairpin had already been transferred to the fish. It seemed to be some sort of magical artifact meant to stabilize the soul and body. The artifact didn't contain much energy, only enough to lock onto a weak residual soul like Mido's. If the soul were any stronger, it might not be able to restrain it. With the help of the hairpin's magic, Mido's soul could potentially be sustained through some simple energy supplements. But those energy sources all came from wizard materials, which meant they'd be expensive. And judging by Sandor's clothing and living conditions, he didn't seem to have much savings. As Saul remained silent, Sandor began to look increasingly nervous. He seemed to realize the answer already, and his face turned pale again. He opened his mouth, but didn't dare speak his guess aloud. Ultimately, Saul decided to let Sandor make the call. After all, the one who wanted to care for Mido was Sandor. Mido's current condition is unusual. Judging by the speed her energy is dissipating, with the golden hairpin, she can last around half a year. After that, she'll completely fade away. Seeing Sandor start to sway on his feet, Saul finally continued, "Unless you can regularly provide her with energy supplements. But any such material is expensive. You need to be mentally prepared, otherwise, you might end up losing both her and your money." Saul took out pen and paper, wrote down a material name and rough price in midair, then folded it in two and pinched it between his thumb and index finger, holding it out to Sander. Sander looked down at his carefree little sister playing in the narrow water orb, then clenched his teeth and reached out his hand. Just as he was about to touch the paper, Saul flipped his wrist and pulled it away. Sander looked at him in confusion. "The secret you mentioned in your letter about Bluewater Bay, what is it? I need to see if it's worth what's written on this paper." A wizard's knowledge, naturally, was valuable too. Sander licked his dry lips. "Lately, I've been earning money by managing document archives for the governor of Bluewater City. While it's mostly trivial records, I'd skim through them while sorting. I found a log of people coming and going from the governor's mansion." Sander instinctively lowered his voice, "and I noticed that one of the wizard lords had moved into the mansion before Bluewater City relocated. Even after the other wizards gradually left, he stayed behind." These clues alone weren't much, but Saul immediately thought of the broken goblet he had obtained and still hadn't traced back to its original owner. He quickly asked, "When did Bluewater City relocate?" "Around 20 years ago." "But didn't you say you arrived by boat just over a decade ago?" "Yes. At the time, Bluewater City had to relocate farther inland, near a barren region, to protect the townspeople from soul tides. But even after the city moved, the port was still in use for a while. It wasn't until nearly 10 years later, when hardly any ships came in anymore, that it finally fell into disuse." "Then did that wizard have any other suspicious behavior?" "One thing stood out. I checked the governor's records of temporary travel plans, and I noticed that every time that wizard left Bluewater City, a soul tide would occur not long after, and he always waited until the tide ended before returning." Chapter 452, The Silver Pocket Watch. After leaving the place where Sander was renting, the carriage moved slowly along the streets of Bluewater City. Saul sat inside the carriage, deep in thought. Truth be told, Sander's suspicion toward that wizard named Karen didn't come with solid evidence. After all, it was completely reasonable for a second-rank apprentice, who had failed to advance to the third rank even in his 50s, to want to find a quiet and safe place to live out his days. As an ordinary person, Sander couldn't possibly know that wizard apprentices could, to some extent, predict the coming of soul tides in advance. But could a mere second-rank apprentice really predict a tide shift 1 or 2 days ahead of time? Saul lightly shook the page of recorded numbers Sander had given him. It was a string of digits written down from Sander's memory. Before Saul had come, Sander only dared to keep this information in his mind. He didn't even dare write it down. That being said, Sander's memory was impressive. It was a pity he was already in his 30s. Otherwise, Saul might have tested whether he could become a wizard apprentice. Saul already had too many people around him. He had no intention of taking on a student. Mentor Kaz probably had no interest in accepting a new apprentice at the moment either. There were some other wizard factions nearby. The largest one was Baton Academy in the city of Kaugus City. But since Sander was already over 30, nearing 40, all of that was just idle speculation. In addition to the note, Sander also gave Saul a family heirloom. According to him, it had been left to him by his grandfather before he died. At the time, his stepmother hadn't yet married into the family, so the only ones to receive gifts from the grandfather were him and his sister, Mido. Mido received a golden hairpin. Sander got a rusted silver pocket watch. The casing was rusted and the hands inside spun erratically. Though his grandfather had said it was a family heirloom, Sander had never been able to use it. He simply kept it on him as a keepsake. But considering Mido's hairpin had such mysterious power, perhaps the pocket watch wasn't ordinary either. The rusted silver pocket watch had also become a symbol of Sander's identity. He didn't dare take it out in public, nor could he unlock its hidden power. Giving it to Saul was the only possible token of value he could offer. Originally, he hadn't intended to give the pocket watch as a reward. But after Saul brought Mido to him, Sander no longer knew how else to repay this kind-hearted wizard. Saul had already memorized the content of the note. A small flame rose in his palm, and he turned the paper into ash. Then he looked at the rusted silver pocket watch. The mysterious ability of Mido's hairpin had intrigued him, but since it had been the last spiritual anchor for the poor girl's soul, Saul hadn't tried to take it. However, the nightmare butterfly had been incessantly whispering in his mind, urging him to kill Sander, seize the hairpin and pocket watch, and leave no witness who knew the items were in his possession. Such behavior was entirely in line with the nightmare butterfly's usual way of doing things, but Saul refused. He brushed off the dust on his hand and opened the rusted silver pocket watch again. Agu, seated opposite him, looked over with keen interest. "Master, the pattern on this watch is quite unusual. I suspect it's not something from the lunar era." As a soul that had once wandered the archives, Agu had read many books and suffered much for it. Still, he persisted in absorbing knowledge, always searching for a way to escape the wizard tower. If it's not from the lunar era, then it must be at least over 300 years old. If that was the case, then the rust on the watch was surprisingly minimal. It was in pretty good condition. "What era came before the lunar era?" Saul asked. This was one of his knowledge gaps. Back in the day, he had only studied practical knowledge useful for survival and advancement. He didn't know much about history or geography. Before the lunar era was the Dark Moon era. Not much is written about it in books, just that wizards were often at war back then, though the reasons aren't clear. At that time, a continent would typically only have 2 or 3 empires. Unlike now, where empires are rare, and most places are made up of smaller kingdoms or even duchies with limited territory and power, Agu said with a smile. In fact, among all the duchies, the Kema Duchy is already one of the larger ones in terms of territory. In the southwest of the Stat continent, there's a patch of land about the same size as Kema's domain, and there are 7 small duchies crammed into it. That sounds about right. As a well-traveled transmigrator, Saul wasn't particularly surprised. He swept the rusted pocket watch with his mental energy, but didn't detect any magical fluctuations. He repeatedly opened the watch, even pried off the back cover and removed the chain, but still found no sign of it functioning as a magic tool. The only thing of note was its unusual engravings. And the hands of the watch truly moved erratically. One moment it showed 3:15 in the afternoon, and after a single flip, it read 9:22 in the morning. Saul continued watching the movements and time shifts, trying to find a pattern but found none. Of course, it was possible he simply hadn't discovered it yet. Hidden this well, now that's interesting. Saul put the watch away. We'll all study it together later. As a wizard who carried around 6 consciousness entities and 2 pets, Saul wasn't worried about lacking research assistance. His only concern was that his resources wouldn't be enough to keep up with their consumption. He had thought about it. If he was truly going to Broderland to establish his own wizard tower, he had to be prepared for its dangers. And once the tower was built, he would also need to create his own research projects, not work for others anymore, but focus on his own knowledge, abilities, and talents. As for those projects, the main one would certainly be the diary. His own soul, which wasn't repelled by any body, was also worth studying. The carriage continued along the streets of Bluewater City, but not to find a place to stay. Saul didn't plan to stay in Bluewater, so he had instructed the coachman, Marsh, to head straight for the airship terminal. Might as well make use of what Master Gorsa had left behind. Even if he suspected that the Broken Goblet's owner was that Karen wizard, he had no intention of confirming it. After all, the man's goal was probably just Gorsa's resurrection experiment. And in truth, their plan had already succeeded. Lady Yura hadn't been revived, and the Master had left the western continent. Saul was now planning to go to the Broderland, but before that, he needed to prepare thoroughly. That included, but was not limited to strengthening himself and learning more about the Broderland. He couldn't just charge in blindly. Even with the dead wizard's diary giving him foresight, there were dangers that no amount of warning could prevent. His current plan was to head for the prosperous and wealthy city of Kaugust. Its urban culture was quite unique. Wizards there had set aside their lofty pride and created many magical tools for the convenience of everyday life. Its social structure was different from that of the duchies, and most importantly, they sold magical tools that Saul had been interested in for a long time. That unique cultural shift was probably the real reason Baton Academy had been able to take root and rise quickly after emerging from the Broderland. Just then the carriage began to slow and gradually came to a halt. Saul and Agu both looked outside. A few pedestrians on the street had also stopped and were looking in the direction of Saul's carriage. A servant-looking man had just stepped out and blocked the carriage. But this man, who had been used to throwing his weight around in Bluewater City, didn't expect that. Instead of stopping immediately, the carriage only slowed gradually. When the carriage finally stopped, the tall horse at the front raised its lips and sprayed saliva all over him. Marsh snorted inwardly, as if I'd pull up quickly for some random guy blocking the road. "What is it?" The servant finally realized that his hasty move to stop the carriage had annoyed them. Terrified, he stepped back and fell to the ground. "Please inform the Wizard Lord inside that Lord Mayor Macon of Bluewater and Wizard Karen have prepared a fine banquet and comfortable lodging to welcome him." Marsh curled his lip. Now that's the proper attitude. He turned back and repeated the message quietly through the door crack. "That Karen wizard actually inviting me. Could it be a trap?" Saul looked toward the diary floating in his mind. The diary drifted lazily in place and flipped itself over with a yawn. Chapter 453, Invitation. Saul wasn't sure whether Wizard Karen had noticed anything unusual, or whether the man himself had something wrong about him in the first place. But if this person truly was the owner of the Broken Goblet, then this might be the best opportunity to approach him before he realized something had gone wrong in Bluewater Bay. "Penny, can you check this servant's memory and see if that Wizard Karen has left Bluewater City recently?" A silver butterfly flew out from between Saul's brows. "For an ordinary person, of course that's no problem. I can access all his recent memories. If I couldn't even do that, it would be a waste of all that veiled crystal essence you fed me, Brother Saul." Penny's voice held a trace of pride. But before she could fly out, little Algie suddenly darted out from behind Saul's neck and used his wet tongue to write a single word on the wall of the carriage. "Laugh." Agu's face was complicated. Of all the characters he'd taught little Algie, this was the one he remembered the best. Saul's face remained expressionless, though he chuckled silently to himself. "Little Algie, you really know how to mock people." Penny fluttered furiously, but she was helpless against little Algie. That simple-minded blob didn't even dream. Trying to console herself, Penny told herself not to stoop to the level of a mudball. She flew out, then soon returned. In the servant's memory, Wizard Karen hasn't left his lab in a long time. He only just came out recently because the city lord summoned him. Saul gave it a little thought. Since he's already sent someone to invite me, I may as well go. He handed the broken goblet to Agu, just in case Karen really was its owner and had some way of sensing it. It was better not to bring it along. After that, Saul boarded the carriage the servant had prepared and headed alone to the city lord's estate. City Lord Macon received Saul in the main hall, where a generous spread of food and wine had been laid out. Beautiful maids and handsome servants stood ready to serve. In all of Bluewater City, there were few who could still afford such a lavish reception. But Saul touched none of it. After the introductions, he got straight to the point. Perhaps used to the directness of wizards, Macon showed no awkwardness at all. Smiling, he raised his glass and said, "To be honest, Bluewater City hasn't seen a new wizard in quite a long time. I wonder, Lord Saul, are you just passing through, or do you intend to stay for a while?" Saul glanced at the silent wizard Karen, who seemed uncomfortable with socializing. "I came to see a friend. Now that I've met them, I plan to leave. No need for concern, Lord City." Saul currently had no desire to reveal that he came from a wizard tower, so his words were more polite than usual. "Oh no, that wasn't my meaning." Though he was indeed somewhat worried, Macon refused to admit it aloud. He waved his hand quickly, not spilling a drop from his wineglass. "Actually, Bluewater City would very much like to invite Lord Saul to settle here. While we're not especially wealthy, we're close to Bluewater Bay and do have some rare alchemical materials. We're also near Caugus City, but far enough to be peaceful, an ideal residence for someone of your stature." He was trying to recruit him. Saul was taken aback, but then realized the concealing spell cast by Master Gorsa was still in effect. The man probably mistook him for a wandering third-rank wizard. And since his words didn't suggest any awareness of Saul's true strength, even though a true wizard would never be enticed by Bluewater City's modest offer, Macon likely figured the worst that could happen was a polite rejection. No harm in trying. He might even glean some information. Naturally, Macon was more than happy to give it a shot. Meanwhile, Wizard Karen quietly sipped a black mulberry drink that dyed both his lips and teeth pitch black. Karen doesn't seem bothered about anyone coming to divide his profits, but if he's really involved with the broken goblet, he surely wouldn't want another wizard settling nearby. With that in mind, Saul feigned interest, stroking his chin in thought. Just then, Penny, who had secretly flown over to Karen, returned and whispered into Saul's ear, "Saul, that Karen definitely isn't just a second-rank apprentice. I probed his mental realm. He hid it well, but I could tell. He's most likely a first-rank wizard. I didn't dig deeper, though, in case he noticed." Saul kept a polite smile on his face. "I'll be heading to Caugus City, so I won't trouble you or Wizard Karen further." Macon looked mildly disappointed, but he had expected this result from the start. He quickly composed himself. "In that case, please enjoy some of Bluewater City's finest delicacies before you leave." He gestured for everyone to begin eating again. The servants brought out fresh dishes. One of them was a rare blackwater snail, though its parts useful for magic had already been removed. Saul pretended to eat, but everything actually went into his sleeve, where little Algae consumed it all. The soul-devouring mire gave him magic and poison resistance far beyond normal creatures. The only real weakness was his vulnerability to fire. More importantly, some things little Algae could eat and then spit back out untouched. This would let Saul test them openly later to see if any tampering had been done. Just one way to assess whether Karen was harmless or dangerous. But before he could feed little Algae much more, a middle-aged knight suddenly burst in, looking urgent and flustered. "City Lord, Lord Karen, something happened, no, something wonderful. The dark clouds above Bluewater Bay are starting to disperse." The knight was clearly agitated and a bit dazed. City Lord Macon leapt to his feet, bumping the table so hard his wine spilled all over the fish on his plate. "The clouds are clearing." Wizard Karen, who had been little more than scenery until now, immediately stood up. Upon hearing the knight confirm that the dark clouds were receding, he turned and walked straight out of the hall. "Lord Karen, where are you going?" Macon wanted to invite him to the shore together, but to his surprise, Karen headed for the garden instead. "I need to retrieve my instruments for testing." "Let me join you," Macon said quickly. But one of his officials leaned in and whispered, "Lord, we don't know if it's dangerous yet. Perhaps it would be better to send someone else ahead to check." Hearing that, Macon slowed his steps immediately, then said, "Then I'll trouble you to take a look first. I'll stay here to accompany Lord Saul." "No need, City Lord. Go ahead, it sounds important. I'll return to my companions." Macon no longer had the heart to continue the feast and didn't insist. "Lord Saul, please consider staying the night. If the darkness truly lifts, it'll be a cause for great celebration. We might host a grand banquet tonight, and we'd be honored if you'd attend." "That's fine. I'd like to see how things unfold as well," Saul said with a smile. Macon assigned a servant to show Saul to his guest quarters, unaware that Saul was thinking only one thing. "As soon as Karen and Macon leave, I'm getting out of here." If Karen really was the owner of the broken goblet, then upon returning and noticing it missing, it wouldn't take long to suspect Saul. A wizard capable of concealing his strength and hiding for who knew how many years. A known associate of the sinister mentor Gudor. Even though the diary had issued no danger warning yet, Saul had no intention of clashing with him. But what Saul didn't expect at all was this. Just as he stepped out of the banquet hall, a black longsword fell from the sky with a thud, cutting Wizard Karen in half mid-step. The blade was so familiar. I had seen it not long ago. Chapter 454, Whose Luck Is It? Saul recognized that black magic blade. It belonged to Jassim, the second-rank wizard who had nearly ruined Saul's pursuit of Gudo. He immediately stepped half a pace back, positioning himself within the shadows of the hall. The battle in the courtyard was far from over. The first servant who had rushed out suddenly let out a shriek, then was split cleanly in two. Only after the body hit the ground did the innards slowly spill out, forming a grotesque mess. The wizard Karen, who had just been cleaved in two, reformed perfectly in the blink of an eye. Once he recovered, he instantly threw up 7 or 8 layers of magical shields and activated several defensive magical tools. Macon, who had some awareness of these things, immediately realized what was going on when he saw this. His longtime friend was clearly no mere second-rank apprentice. Originally intending to check on the situation, the Lord turned on his heel and bolted deep into the hall, clearly determined never to step outside again. Saul observed this and thought, well, he wouldn't laugh at someone only slightly more cowardly than himself. Just then the piercing voice of Wizard Karen echoed from the courtyard. "Lord Jassim, I'm so close to advancing to a second-rank wizard, please, just a bit more time." A cold voice replied from the sky above. "Deadlines are deadlines. No delay, no excuses. Besides, you've already been running for 43 years and 122 days. That merciless voice was accompanied by the repeated descent of the black blade. Each time it fell, one of Karen's carefully prepared defensive spells or enchanted tools would be destroyed. "You must know I didn't survive all these years without paying a price. I swear I'll succeed this time. Please, just a bit longer." This time, not even a cold reply came. Only the relentless black blade struck down again, shredding all of Karen's defenses. Facing a second-rank wizard, Karen had no hope. As a last attempt, he raised his hands and shouted, "I have a broken goblet. If you give me 10 more years, I'll hand it over to you right now." There was a slight pause in the attacks from the sky. Karen quickly looked around. "Don't worry. If you kill everyone here, no one will know the goblet ever reached your hands, and as someone already hunted by the tribunal, I won't be alive to say anything." His words sent everyone, servants and officials alike, into a panic. Those with more nerve tried to flee, terrified out of their wits. Saul didn't move, but readied himself internally. The next second the black blade fell again, this time chopping off Karen's arms. He let out a scream, and Saul felt a black shadow suddenly lunge toward him. With a burst of mental power, Saul lashed out with touch of torment, whipping the shadow back. The black shadow snapped back into Karen's body, who let out another shriek. At that moment, Jasim's next attack landed. Karen had no way to dodge it now. The damage couldn't be transferred, and seeing that Saul was a true wizard, Karen realized he had no chance of escape. "I see now. The incident in Bluewater Bay was your doing, the broken goblet." With gritted teeth, Karen suddenly separated his soul from his body. His body exploded instantly. There was no fire from the blast, but thick smoke spread like a fog bomb. From within the fog, dozens of soul bodies began to flee. Each one had indistinct features, similar to the soul escape technique Gyudo had used on the ship. But Jasim, having seen this trick before, wasn't fooled again. He rubbed his hands together, and the black blade shattered into hundreds of shards, flying toward the escaping spirits. Any fragment that hit a fleeing soul instantly turned it to dust. Still, more than 10 shrieked and scattered in all directions. On their way out, they didn't even try to avoid normal people, just passed straight through. Any unfortunate soul they touched was immediately frozen stiff. Seconds later, the black blade shards would pierce through the servant's body and continue their pursuit. Soon, corpses littered the courtyard. Strangely, no one in the banquet hall was harmed. Because Saul stood at the entrance, blocking every incoming spirit and blade shard. He could tell that the shards weren't as deadly as the full blade, likely just meant to identify the real target. As he defended, Saul's gaze remained fixed on the thick fog in the courtyard. Back when Gyudo had escaped, he had melted through the ship's deck. Could Karen be trying the same trick? Suddenly, the bricks beneath Saul's feet bulged upward, and a shadow slithered up his robe. Then little Algie, having snuck back, passed along a vague message. A mischievous brow-wiggle kind of feeling. "It's done," Saul's heart stirred. He cast breeze to dispel the fog from the courtyard. Underneath, where the ground had been flat, now there was a hole. A soul jumped out from below. Though its features were indistinct, Saul could tell this was Karen's true self. That soul cast a chilling gaze at Saul, and his skin crawled with cold. But this time Saul didn't look away. He stared right back. The earlier conversation made it clear. Karen was the owner of the broken goblet. Since that was the case, Saul would make sure the man died utterly and completely. As Karen's real body surfaced, the blade shards that had chased the false spirits suddenly reversed course and converged on the center from all sides, sky and ground included. Clearly, Jasim had been prepared and wasn't fooled by Karen's decoy. It was like the sound of rain on banana leaves. Saul squinted as he watched the blades punch holes through Karen's soul like a sieve. A surge of energy bled out, and the soul body quickly lost shape. Saul stepped out of the hall and looked up, finally spotting Jasim floating in midair. His face was expressionless. It seemed he had never once been tempted by the broken goblet. His only goal was to kill. He's still weaker than Master Gorsa at second rank, Saul thought. After all, Gorsa always eliminated threats in the blink of an eye. Just as Jasim was preparing a final strike, he suddenly paused. He raised his left hand and looked at his wrist. Down below Karen, his soul already withered, burst into eerie laughter. "Ahaha, you're out of time too. Ha, you came to kill me. You should have dealt with Yo." His words were cut off. The black blade dropped from the sky and split his soul in two. The battered spirit deflated like a popped balloon and quickly dissolved into a puddle of black goo. But Saul no longer cared about Karen. He now stared at Jassim, burning with curiosity about what this time limit meant. Jassim turned his head to look at Saul. His face had paled, and his smile, compared to last time, was oddly gentler. "We meet again, Gorsa's student. Thanks for exposing Karen's real body. You saved me some time." "You're welcome, Lord Jassim," Saul replied with his signature obedient smile. "You just used a dark element spell." "Yes, Lord Jassim." "Then it's your luck you keep running into me." Saul's smile froze. That sounded weird. Jassim suddenly raised his right hand and stuck his index finger into the back of his own skull. "My belongings belong to the tribunal and can't be given away, but my knowledge can." He slowly withdrew his finger. At its tip writhed a small black snake, which he tossed at Saul. Saul's heart skipped. He reached out to catch it, but the snake slithered straight into his forehead. It dove directly into his mental realm and immediately prepared to strike, only to spot the diary floating above. It froze with fear, curled up weakly in the air, not daring to move. The diary gave no warning, which meant the snake wasn't lethal. Saul shifted his attention back to Jassim, now with a hint of hostility. No matter if the snake was knowledge, Jassim's approach was far too overbearing. But Jassim, seeing Saul still standing unharmed, paused for a second and smiled again. "As expected of Gorsa's student, impressive talent, your mental strength is outstanding. Perhaps this wasn't your luck at all, but mine." Without explaining further, he recalled the black blade, then stabbed it into his own forehead. Thump! His corpse fell from the sky, landing next to Karen's blackened remains. Chapter 455, Terrifying Upon Reflection. Saul, along with everyone around who was still alive and conscious, was utterly shocked. How could a proper second rank just die like that? Penny flew over, cautiously approaching Jassim's corpse, then hovered over the puddle of slime that was all that remained of Karen. "Brother Saul, they're both completely dead." Only then did Saul walk over and crouch beside Jassim's body. No matter what, this Jassim was still a second-rank wizard. What exactly was that time limit? How could it make him just drop dead like that? "Brother Saul, could it be what Agu mentioned before, something about the limit of life?" "That's certainly a possibility. But for something that concerns one's very life, it's hard to imagine someone being so decisive about self-sacrifice." Saul recalled how anxious Jassim had seemed back on the airship, looking like he was pressed for time. Back then, had he already known his time was almost up? Was that why, after confirming Saul wasn't his target, he immediately left to pursue others? Saul reached out and grabbed Jassim's left arm. Just earlier, it was after looking at his left arm that he confirmed his time was up. But as Saul examined the arm now, whether checking for mental shockwaves, magic fluctuations, or using his semi-immersive meditation technique, he found absolutely nothing. Maybe whatever was acting on him vanished the moment he died. And now, paired with the semi-immersive meditation from the erosion diagram, the anomalies it can detect are becoming fewer and fewer. I think it's time to find a better meditation method. Even after advancing to a true wizard, Saul hadn't yet switched his meditation technique. First, because he'd leveled up too quickly and hadn't had time to search for a suitable meditation diagram. Second, because he was reluctant to part with the abilities granted by the erosion diagram. Both the semi-immersive meditation and the soul projection technique from the erosion diagram had played major roles in his adventures. If he were to switch to a new meditation method, it would be best if it also included these two abilities, or at the very least, retain the convenience of soul projection. After all, the observational ability of the semi-immersive meditation could be substituted by the nightmare butterfly. Still, if I want to understand what exactly happened to Jassim, I have one more method. Saul stood back up, retrieved the tools used to draw magic formations from his pack, and began preparing a soul extraction ritual on the spot. Well, soul extraction, not soul summoning. As he began drawing, the surviving crowd around him, along with Lord Mayor Macon from the banquet hall, finally walked out, still visibly shaken. At first, Lord Macon's legs were so weak he could barely stand, needing support from his guards to move. After years of living alongside the seemingly harmless wizard Karen, he had long forgotten how terrifying a true wizard could be when it came to harvesting lives, and how utterly powerless ordinary people were in comparison. Even knights, great knights, weren't enough to withstand a single fragment of a black blade from the Skyborn wizards. This world truly belonged to the wizards. He approached and saw Saul drawing the formation. Summoning his courage, he pushed aside the guard holding him up and stepped forward. "Lord Saul, what should we do now? Is there anything I can assist with?" Saul paused, turning to glance at him. It was obvious from Lord Macon's eyes that he was still terrified. Saul smiled, offering some reassurance. "I'm fine here. Go help organize the others. That explosion likely alerted people outside the mansion too. If we don't deal with it quickly, it might cause panic." "Ah, yes, of course," Macon replied immediately, though his feet didn't move. "Lord Saul, is there any risk of contamination here?" Saul looked toward the black slime beside them. "Normally no, but I can't rule out the possibility of it attracting something from elsewhere. I'll do a basic cleanup, but I recommend you keep people away from this courtyard for the next 10 years. "Yes, yes," Macon agreed even more quickly this time. "I'll have everyone evacuate right now. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to let us know." With that, Macon seemed to regain his role as mayor and began directing people to tend to the injured and remove the dead. Very soon, the courtyard was completely cleared. And since this was just a guest courtyard, sealing it for 10 years wouldn't affect his operations at all. Of course, if he remained uneasy about it, he could always just move to another building to serve as the mayoral residence. After all, in Bluewater City, over half the houses were unoccupied. Once the crowd had dispersed, Saul's soul extraction formation was also complete. He casually tossed the leftover materials back into his pack, then moved Jassim's corpse into the center of the formation. After that, Saul stepped into the formation himself, making a spellcasting gesture with both hands pressed to his chest. Instantly, white flames rose beneath his feet. The fire flowed like waves, blazing at first, then gradually dimming. When Saul opened his eyes again, his brows slowly knit together. Nothing. Jassim's method of suicide destroyed his soul as well. Aside from some scattered energy, there's no intact consciousness left. In fact, Saul could have tried to use soul fishing to catch Jassim's soul at the moment of his death. But who knew what hidden dangers that might have carried? What if there was a timed explosive buried in his soul? That kind of risk wasn't worth it. A second-rank wizard was still too unpredictable. Jassim probably understood that too. That's why he handed those pieces of knowledge directly to me before he died. Saul once again sensed the tiny black snake inside his mental realm, still desperately trying to make itself invisible, and shook his head. Strong-willed man, part of a strong-willed organization. He stepped out of the formation and raised a hand, casting 2 fireballs to burn what remained of Karen's spirit and Jassim's body into ash. With that done, Saul inspected the courtyard and the banquet hall once more, ensuring no wraiths had been born before finally leaving. Outside the gate, Lord Macon was waiting with some men and several large chests, eagerly looking toward the door. The moment he saw Saul emerge, he hurried over. "Lord Saul, I had them bring everything from Karen's residence. As for his lab, the servants couldn't enter and wouldn't dare to anyway. Why don't you come with us to take a look? If you find anything useful, please take it. We common folk have no use for a wizard's belongings." This Lord Macon was indeed quick-witted. He'd already gathered Saul's spoils of war. But Saul suspected that, since Karen had been hiding his identity and strength, his official residence likely wouldn't have held anything truly valuable. As expected, aside from a few dozen magic crystals and some low-grade magic materials, there was nothing else of note. The study notes clearly looked like they were meant to fool low-level apprentices. Saul skimmed them and tossed them aside. After that, Saul firmly refused Lord Macon's offer to stay another night. Leaving the mayor's residence, he saw Marsh waiting in a small alley across the street. Marsh immediately brought the carriage over. Saul boarded, and after they traveled 2 blocks, the door opened and Agu slipped inside. "Master, there was a strong magic fluctuation at the mayor's residence just now, which vanished quickly afterward. I split up with Marsh to try and find you. After waiting for a while and seeing people come out to calm the townsfolk, I had Marsh wait at the gate for you. Jassim showed up at the mayor's mansion just now." Saul recounted the events that had just occurred, then asked Agu, "Do you know what the time limit is, and what the tribunal is?" Agu looked troubled and shook his head. "This is my first time hearing of a time limit. As for the tribunal, I have heard the name before, but I don't know the details. Both the time limit and the tribunal seem to be terms from the continent of Nefret. That continent lies further to the south. It's said to be rather closed off and is quite far from the continent of Stat, so very few people come over to this side." Saul leaned his head against the carriage window. Through the gap in the curtains, he could see many townsfolk stepping out of their homes, looking anxiously toward the mayor's mansion. If Jassim took his own life because he was being controlled, then that means the tribunal can already extend its reach into the continent of Stat. But if he wasn't under control, then thinking about this whole thing in detail is even more terrifying. Chapter 456. A Good Deed Rewarded. Not long after Saul left Bluewater City, Lord Macon was finally freed from the aftermath and cleanup work. He collapsed into his ornate armchair in exhaustion, but suddenly sat up straight as if something had struck him. "Right, where is Lord Saul's friend staying again?" His personal steward immediately stepped forward and bowed. "At number 16, Shrimp Street, Lord. Send 2 teams, one to clear out my little garden villa on East Street, the other to invite Lord Saul's friend from Shrimp Street to move in. Be courteous. Lord Saul might return to visit his friend." However, when the steward personally led a team to help Sander move, they were flatly rejected. Sander only said that he was also leaving Bluewater City, which left the steward with a sense of regret. Sander had acquired a sturdy glass tank, intending to bring his sister, Mido, with him to the city of Caugust. Only there would he have a chance to earn more money to support her, and perhaps encounter Lord Saul again. But just as he finished packing and stepped out the door, he suddenly noticed that Mido didn't seem quite right. She kept rolling around inside the newly purchased fish tank. "Mido, what's wrong?" Sander immediately picked up the tank, inspecting it from every angle. Yet before the human-faced fish could say anything, a knock suddenly came at the door. Knock, 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 knock. The rhythm of the knocking was a little strange. Holding the tank, Sander stared blankly toward the door. He remembered clearly that the gate to his courtyard was locked. How could someone knock directly on his front door? And that rhythm. Knock, 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 knock. There it was again, no mistake. A deeply buried memory surged from the depths of his mind. Fear crept across Sander's face. Then the knock came a 3rd time. As if accepting his fate, Sander set the tank down and walked to the door, opening it. Standing outside were 3 people, one of whom, though visibly aged, he recognized instantly. Instinctively, Sander stepped forward to block the view of the little fish inside. You, I've been hiding all these years. Why are you still trying to hunt me down? Sander knew full well that he and Mido had only escaped back then, because those people hadn't truly meant to kill them. Otherwise, how could ordinary people possibly escape a wizard's pursuit? He thought that by hiding his identity on another continent and living a low-profile, impoverished life, he could spend the rest of his days in peace. But they had come anyway. Had reaching out to a wizard for his sister's sake alerted his stepmother. "You're mistaken," the elderly man, the only one Sander recognized, spoke gently. "His Majesty Arxes passed away from illness 3 months ago, and none of his children inherited the Evernight bloodline. We've come to escort you back to hold your coronation, Prince Alessandra." Sander, no, Alessandra, stood frozen as his mouth slowly fell open. Middle-aged, suddenly inheriting a vast fortune. Is there a way to wake up even later into this kind of dream? 10 minutes later, still somewhat dazed, Alessandra stepped out of the narrow little house, tightly clutching the fish tank that held his sister, and boarded a black, solemn, and majestic carriage. The carriage wasn't pulled by horses, but by 2 tall male centaurs. Their upper bodies were clad in armor, while their sleek, glossy horse halves glistened beneath. Centaurs surpassed ordinary men in strength, constitution, speed, and agility. But their flaw was their wild nature. They were hard to tame. Only true wizards could truly command them. Of the 3 who had come to fetch Alessandra, the other 2 besides the old man were both first-rank official wizards. Just before boarding the carriage, Alessandra noticed that the Lord of Bluewater City was standing nearby, seemingly trying to approach him for a word. But Alessandra merely shook his head, refusing the approach. Watching the black, majestic carriage pulled by centaurs depart, Lord Macon felt as though his entire worldview had been shattered. The wizard friend he had known for years turned out not to be a mere apprentice, but a true wizard who hadn't hesitated for a second to kill. Bluewater City, which hadn't seen a wizard for ages, had suddenly become the battleground of 3 of them. 2 had died, one of them even a second-rank wizard. Having finally seen off the victorious one with utmost respect, he had thought to gain favor with Saul's friend, Sander. But who would have thought that the man he believed had been rescued turned out to be a noble taken away in full display by 2 wizards? What good fortune has Bluewater City ever done to deserve this? His steward beside him let out a sigh. When you sent people to invite Mr. Sander to a better residence, he was so grateful, yet now, with his new status, he won't even speak a word to us. The steward, who had served Lord Macon for many years, dared to speak so plainly. Lord Macon thought quietly for a moment, then suddenly shook his head. "Let this matter end here. Instruct everyone not to gossip. Do not mention the reason we invited Mr. Sander to move, and certainly do not speak of his connection to the wizard." The steward froze, not fully understanding, but nodded nonetheless. "I've always sent others to contact Mr. Sander. This was the first time I met him myself. He didn't seem arrogant, not the type to reject me out of pride." Lord Macon turned his gaze toward the old, dilapidated house where Sander had lived. "The only thing between us was Saul. Could it be that he didn't let me speak because he didn't want Saul mentioned? Perhaps being taken away isn't as good a thing as it seems." In the end, Lord Macon decided to pretend he knew nothing. Better safe than sorry. At that moment, the black carriage pulled by centaurs had already left Bluewater City and was headed for the coast. It seemed they planned to set sail. The human-faced fish, which Sander had been tightly clutching, was now in the hands of one of the wizards. Upon inspection, they quickly realized it was a fish containing a human soul. But they didn't object to Sander keeping such a strange creature. In fact, they promised to examine it for anything that might harm him, and if it proved safe, they would even help him take proper care of it to ensure it didn't die easily. Halfway through the journey, the elderly man suddenly turned his head with a kind and gentle smile. "Prince Alessandra, Sander still wasn't used to the name he had discarded for over a decade. "Please, just call me Sander." "If that is your wish. Then, Lord Sander, do you still remember the silver pocket watch that Evernight VII once gave you?" Sander's eyelid twitched. He pursed his lips, and a trace of embarrassment showed on his face. "I'm sorry, not long after I arrived in Stat. I had to sell most of my valuables just to survive." The old man twitched at the corners of his mouth but quickly composed himself. "It's not your fault, Lord Sander. Never mind. For centuries, Evernight failed to unlock the Wildland compass. Perhaps it was never meant for the Evernight Empire after all." Sander bowed his head again in quiet awkwardness, still looking apologetic and humble. What? On the opposite end of the same highway traveled by that black carriage, Saul's own slightly smaller two-passenger carriage was rolling along cheerfully. While checking his personal belongings, Saul suddenly noticed that the diary in his mind had flipped open on its own. Lunar calendar, year 317, June 8th, clear skies. Your good deed has been met with a kind reward. The world is strange like that sometimes. Can good people actually receive good fortune? But are you truly a good person? Perhaps only the chaos domain can reveal the true colors of your soul. After all, the key just so happens to be in your hands. Chapter 457, Kaugus City. Saul had originally planned to continue riding the airship for free under Master Gorsa's name. But while waiting at the platform, he suddenly overheard a few wizards discussing the collapse of a wizard tower, Gorsa's advancement to the third rank, and his rampage on the border between Kema and Kinas, followed by his departure from the Stat continent. After a moment's thought, Saul instructed the coachman, Marsh, to turn the carriage around and leave the airship platform. Fortunately, it wouldn't take a whole month to reach Kaugus City, where Baton Academy was located. At Marsh's driving speed, it would only take about 10 days. Kaugus was also a coastal city, but the region between it and Bluewater City wasn't nearly as prosperous. It mostly consisted of wastelands, highlands, and wild forests. There were even a few places where abnormal smoke was still rising. Who knew if there were wizards conducting environmentally destructive experiments there? This world didn't care about environmental protection. The strange pollution created by wizards could easily turn an entire wilderness into a dead zone. The only force that could restrain them was the large wizarding factions. Within the territories controlled by those factions, if someone conducted highly destructive experiments, they could be fined or even have their research confiscated. But as far as Saul knew, there was one place without such restrictions: the borderland. In the borderland, no one would care whether you were destroying the environment, but if your experiment interfered with someone else, they might just come and kill you outright. It was exactly because of this unrestrained experimentation and the resulting pollution that the borderland was riddled with danger, a place where death could strike at any moment. But to someone like Saul with an external cheat, such a place was perfect. Since he had already decided to go to Hanging Hands Valley to cultivate his own wizard tower, Saul had been gathering information on the area. But the information was fragmented and highly piecemeal. One of the notes he found ended with a scribbled remark. "Honestly, I know these records are probably pointless. The borderland changes all the time. What was a safe and peaceful fruit orchard this time might become a monster-infested death trap next time. Still, I chose to write it down. After all, before dying, it's better to leave something behind in this world." The last page of the notebook was stained with a dark reddish-brown substance. Saul conducted a component analysis and found that it was just ordinary blood. As the sky darkened, Saul closed the notebook and took out the shattered wine glass and rusted silver pocket watch. These two items were his greatest physical haul from Bluewater Bay. The silver pocket watch, was even more precious than Nefret's well-known magical tools. After all, the diary had specifically mentioned the silver pocket watch. For the past few days, aside from his basic magical studies, Saul had been researching these two objects. He placed various soul bodies and soul fragments into the shattered goblet, studying what kind of fragmentation occurred and whether any byproducts were generated. But maybe the dosage was too small, or the time too short, or perhaps the activation method was incorrect. Either way, the soul bodies in the cup were still floating about lazily, showing no signs of being crushed. Saul packed the shattered goblet away and took out the silver pocket watch for further inspection. The diary had mentioned the term chaos domain, which led Saul to suspect that the silver pocket watch might also be a key to a world side. But to activate the watch, a key was required. The diary also said that the key was on his person, so Saul began analyzing the various items he carried. He only analyzed them. He didn't actually try to activate the pocket watch, since he wasn't ready to embark on an interdimensional journey just yet. Today, while rummaging through his belongings, Saul suddenly spotted something. He reached in and pulled out the coin with a smiling face on one side and a crying face on the other. Back when Machi Machi lent him the coin, he had said it was a magical tool from the previous era. It could be used for short-distance communication. But its real purpose was to exchange the spatial positions of its two holders. It was a very rare space-type tool, perfectly suited for either saving yourself or harming someone else. Saul lightly tossed the two coins in the air. When they collided midair, they made a crisp clinking sound. And if one looked closely, they would notice slight spatial distortions around the coins when they collided. These two coins are space-related tools. Could they possibly activate a world-side key too? Catching the coins with a steady hand, Saul turned to the silver pocket watch held by Agu. The watch was open, and its hour and minute hands continued to turn at erratic speeds. Saul tried approaching it with the coins, moving them closer and farther, even tapping the watch, but none of it made the watch's hands behave any differently. Even so, unlike his previous experiments, Saul didn't immediately switch to another tool. Instead, he began recording the experiment's results in earnest. His gut told him that this time he was right. Now it was just a matter of confirmation. No need to rush. Once he found a place to settle down, he could leave it to his other consciousnesses to continue experimenting. With a clear direction, Saul contentedly put the smiling, crying coins away and handed the silver pocket watch back to Agu. He closed his eyes and began to meditate, once again reminding himself that, when he arrived in the bustling Kaugas city, the first thing he needed to do was find a suitable meditation method. Each of his consciousnesses had their own methods from when they were alive, but none suited Saul better than the erosion diagram. That's why he was still using a meditation method meant for second-rank apprentices. Its magic recovery efficiency was indeed too low. Thankfully, his combat style relied primarily on mental force, and he always fought in swift, decisive bursts, so his slow magic recovery didn't really matter. Unconventional indeed. 3 days later, Saul's group finally left the desolate coastal road. Nearby, villages and small towns without walls began to appear. But they all had one thing in common: very few people. Even though the number of houses seemed decent, when mealtime came around, there were hardly any cooking fires to be seen. Relying on his experience as a frequent traveler, Marsh found a small town with decent conditions and drove the carriage in. Saul looked around and noticed that many of the houses along the street had locks hanging on their doors. The locks were covered in dust, clearly indicating the owners hadn't been back in a long time. The carriage finally stopped in front of a tavern. The sign read, "Traveler's Home." Saul and Agu got out of the carriage, but no one came to greet them at the door. Saul pushed open the half-closed door and looked inside, finding the hall completely empty, not a single guest in sight. A tall young man, clearly dressed as a server, was sitting in the corner of the room, absorbed in reading a book. At the bar at the far end of the hall, a slightly chubby middle-aged man was also reading a book. Even the sound of the door opening hadn't disturbed them. Did everyone here love studying this much? Silently, Saul appeared beside the server boy and looked down at the book in his hands. Farmer Little John, city life is hard and noble ladies are too clingy. Saul. For the first time, Saul had the urge to rub his eyes. What on earth did he just see? Was this a Wizard World romance novel? No, it didn't even dare to touch on wizard-related content. Oh, sorry, sirs. Just then, the innkeeper behind the bar finally noticed Saul and Agu. He slammed his book shut and hurriedly ran over from behind the bar. Saul glanced over and noticed the book in the innkeeper's hand was the same as the one the server boy had. Since the boss came out, the server naturally noticed too. He carefully marked a page in his book before getting to his feet. Would you like a meal or a room for the night? Agu answered, one night. Do you have a courtyard? We do, the boy replied. The place next door has one. The previous tenants moved out just a month ago. I can get it ready for you in an hour. Just moved out, Saul's eyes flashed. He no longer rushed to check in. Instead, he sat across from the boy and looked at both him and the innkeeper. Did everyone in your town move to Kaugus City? Chapter 458, The Metropolis. At this moment, the innkeeper had already finished sizing up Saul and Agu. He pushed aside the boy who was about to reply and stepped forward to Saul's side. He leaned slightly, speaking respectfully. Yes, sir. Ever since Kaugus City issued its third recruitment order 3 years ago, even the last few remaining folks in this town moved over there. Now only orphans, the elderly, and the sick are left living here. If it weren't for this inn that I still need to run, I wouldn't have stayed either. Urbanization, huh? Saul hadn't expected Kaugus City to have developed to such a degree, but could the basic productivity of this era keep up with that? If everyone moves to Kaugus City, what happens to the farming? Surely they're not relying entirely on trade. His question caught the innkeeper off guard. So Saul rephrased it. Who's farming the land then? Oh, the farming is all done by serfs, and the innkeeper seemed to understand Saul's question this time, but forgot the word halfway through his answer. And magic tools, sir. The boy, who seemed rather sharp, quickly followed the innkeeper's example in addressing Saul. He could tell Saul wasn't a local, so he helpfully explained. Magic tools are devices made by Baton Academy related to magic. Ordinary people can use them too, and they're really amazing. Farming now only takes a quarter of the time it used to. Baton Academy actually made a batch of magic tools usable by ordinary people. Must be some kind of simplified magic implements. But then, how did they solve the issue of ordinary people suffering corruption from using such tools? Anywhere with magic and mental force could potentially produce corruption. If it were a wizard, even a second-rank apprentice would have some means to deal with that. But if ordinary folks caused corruption using magical tools, how would they deal with it? They likely didn't even have the means to protect themselves. Saul had originally wanted to ask what those magic tools looked like, but after thinking it over, he decided against it. Even if they'd seen them, they wouldn't understand the core principles. Better to see it for himself. Across from him, the boy continued talking like a wind-up toy that had just been released, still enthusiastically explaining. The ones used for farming outside the city are just the simplest tools. The real powerful ones are in the large factories inside Kaugus City. They say even regular people can use magic tools to make even more advanced tools. If I didn't have to take care of my grandfather, I'd have gone into the city with Brother Rough to work. The boy clearly had more to say, but the innkeeper tugged at his sleeve. Saul glanced at the innkeeper. He had a hunch. When the man heard the boy mention those city factories, his expression wasn't nearly as eager as the child. There was even a faint hint of fear. Saul asked a few more questions after that. The boy eagerly answered all of them, saying he got everything from a book. If Saul wanted a full understanding of Kaugus City, he highly recommended reading it, said it was all laid out very clearly. When Saul asked for the book's title, it turned out to be the very novel the boy and the innkeeper had been reading earlier. Even the name sounded unreliable. At that moment, the innkeeper returned to the bar, pulled out a brand new copy of the same book, and offered it to Saul. "Please take it, sir. No charge. These books are freely distributed by the city, and they told us to give them to any traveling guests." What he didn't mention was that, until just now, he'd always been charging travelers for those books. Saul accepted it without hesitation and stopped asking questions. He turned and followed the boy to the courtyard next door to check in. The innkeeper even came by to deliver some food, very enthusiastic. When they left, Saul overheard the boy still muttering about wanting to work in the factory. The innkeeper seemed reluctant to lose his last helper, and claimed that those factory magic tools had eaten people before. The boy just shrugged it off and said that was because workers hadn't operated them properly or followed regulations. Hearing this, Saul weighed the book in his hand and decided to read it before entering the city. The next morning, Saul and the others left the inn and continued toward Kaugus City. Last night, Saul had read his first extracurricular book in the 3 years since he'd arrived in this world. He skipped over the obviously self-indulgent and fantastical parts, focusing on the daily life details described in the city. But even those details deserved quotation marks. The book told of a farmer named Little John, and the many dangers and even eerie incidents he encountered after entering the city. Yet in the end, all those events turned out to be due to human greed or carelessness at work. Wizards were also mentioned in the book, but only briefly. Clearly, the author didn't dare write about them in depth. In the book, wizards were always portrayed as mysterious, powerful, and wise. Every time they developed a new magic tool, it brought great improvements to ordinary people's lives. Even with Marsh driving the carriage, they still spent most of the day on the road. By the time the wagon arrived at the foot of Kaugus City, the sun was already slanting west again. A massive city bathed in orange-red sunlight unfolded before Saul's eyes. The rows upon rows of tall buildings almost made Saul feel like he'd returned to his old world. Kaugus City was built against a mountain, with the southwest sides facing the sea. To the north stood a gently sloping low hill, and only the east side was flat enough for vehicles to pass through. Outside the city was a wall, not particularly high, with soldiers stationed along it. Every few meters along the wall stood a giant crossbow, and every 100 meters there was a square-shaped opening. That same book about Little John entering the city had mentioned these. According to it, those square holes housed magic crystal cannons, explosive devices that ordinary people could operate. The city wall on the eastern side had 3 entry gates, each with a long line of people queued up. But as Saul's carriage approached, 2 mounted soldiers immediately galloped over. One of them held a compass in hand. After confirming it twice, he dismounted and approached Saul respectfully. "Honorable wizard, you do not need to queue to enter the city. Please follow us through this way." Saul opened the carriage door and glanced at the compass in the soldier's hand, finding it quite interesting. His carriage bore no markings of wizard status on the outside, yet the soldier, clearly a regular person, had been able to identify him from afar as a wizard. Obviously, it was the compass at work. Back in the wizard tower, magical tools were mostly used for combat or research. Rarely did one see such public utility applications. Under the guidance of the two riders, the group was led to a fourth entrance. The city gate here, along with the surrounding wall, was painted with hidden formation patterns. As soon as they entered the formation's radiation range, the noisy surroundings suddenly quieted significantly. The two knights deliberately stopped outside the formation, gave a salute, and then rode off. At that moment, another person came forward. He wore a formal uniform in blue and white, a minimalist design, stylish yet unrestrictive for movement. The cuffs, collar, and hem were all adorned with two fine silver threads. "Good afternoon, sir," the man spoke from outside the carriage. "Welcome to Kaugus City. I am Doomer, a second-rank apprentice from Baton Academy. May I ask if you're willing to proceed with identity registration?" Agu stepped out of the carriage, not letting the other party see the interior. "What happens if we agree, and what if we do?" Doomer's smile remained unchanged as he pulled out two metal cards from the pocket on his chest. One was red, the other blue. "We naturally respect your preference. In Kaugus, many places, whether for entry or purchasing, require a pass. So we've prepared two kinds of passes for you. The blue one registers basic information and allows us to offer better services. The red one is an anonymous pass. Most services are still available with it, but for any core business, you may be asked to present proper credentials. Of course, your basic daily needs will absolutely not be affected." Doomer politely held out both passes toward Agu, letting him choose. Chapter 459. Interesting. The blue identity card required registration of personal information and allowed access to more services. The red card didn't require any registration, but might restrict access to certain key areas, unless supplementary information was provided. It was the first time Agu had encountered such a system. Even though the red card offered anonymity, choosing it might actually draw more attention. Unable to make the decision on his own, Agu said, "One moment," and turned back toward the carriage. Although Saul hadn't stepped out of the carriage, he'd been paying close attention to everything outside and naturally heard the conversation. If not for this procedure, he definitely would have entered the city quietly. But wait a minute. Choosing between the red or blue card doesn't really matter for those entering the city. That's because you can register your information anytime if needed. Unless you're just passing through, situations requiring registered info won't be rare. So really, the color of the card isn't important. What's important is that every wizard entering the city will be carrying a card issued by Baton Academy. With that in mind, Saul stepped out of the carriage. "Then we'll take two blue cards. My coachman isn't a wizard, does he need one too? If he is considered your property, we can register his information under your pass. Oh, are you Lord Saul?" Doomer's previously calm smile twitched slightly the moment he saw Saul step down. "You know me." "Of course. As Tower Master Gorse's student, we've been keeping an eye out. We dare not neglect such a distinguished guest." Doomer tried to maintain a natural smile, but Saul could still sense the unease radiating from him. "What are you afraid of? Your mentor is a third-rank wizard. After all, I'm just a little nervous." Could it really be just that simple? Saul lowered his eyes to the blue pass in Doomer's hand. Doomer, however, suddenly pulled his hand back. "Oh, you don't need this type of pass." He quickly flipped open his coat and pulled out a silver pass from an inner pocket. "You may use this one directly. No identity registration required. Please follow me." Doomer's manner had been polite all along, but it had carried a formal, mechanical tone. Now, facing Saul, that mechanical quality shifted into a slightly flustered, yet vivid politeness. He led Saul, his party, and the carriage into the fourth city gate. There was a corridor more than 10 meters long, with torches mounted on either side. The walls were somewhat worn and bore no carved formations. But in the center of the corridor, two small objects fluttered through the air. They resembled little birds, but on closer inspection, they were made of wood and feathers. However, their heads were shaped like large flat discs. As one of them flew toward the entrance, Saul noticed that the disc was embedded with 36 black spheres. Within each black orb, a darker dot seemed to swirl restlessly, like the eyes of a fake bird. A surveillance device, Saul guessed, tilting his head to get a better look. Just then, the bird-like construct flew to within 3 meters of him and angled its disc downward, as if making eye contact with him. For a moment, Saul felt as if all the dark pupils of the construct had turned to look at him, and behind those eyes something, or someone, was watching. But he only held its gaze for a second. The fake bird soon adjusted its angle again and flew off in another direction. Its flight path seemed to follow no clear pattern, nor did it have any conscious will, just a consistent effort to scan the entire area. This kind of random patrolling made it hard to find blind spots or exploit weaknesses. Is this meant to prevent people from sneaking in? But the city wall isn't even that tall. It doesn't reach halfway up some of the skyscrapers inside the city. A slightly capable third-rank apprentice could probably fly right over it. Oh, I suppose there's something installed on top of the walls too. Damn, they're loaded. Doomer led Saul and his group, along with the carriage, through the empty corridor beneath the gate. It wasn't until they reached the gate on the opposite end that a checkpoint booth came into view. 2 people sat inside. These newcomers wore blank expressions. One of them was even reading a book and didn't lift his head, even as Doomer walked up to them. Only when Doomer leaned in to say something did both of them suddenly jerk upright and stare at Saul. Their faces showed curiosity and a desire to scrutinize, but none of the nervousness Doomer had displayed earlier. One of them even began speaking to Doomer right in front of Saul, using telepathy. Once their brief exchange ended, a silver, metallic butterfly lifted off from Doomer's shoulder and fluttered up to hover above Saul's head. One of them is asking, "But he doesn't have gray skin, so how did you recognize him?" Penny translated dutifully. That guy named Doomer responded that it might be disguise magic or a physical transformation. When those 2 saw me, their expressions were completely unfamiliar. There was no moment of recognition. It was like they'd never seen me before. Their uniforms were the same as Doomer, so they must be from Baton Academy as well. But neither of them had any magical fluctuation. Could they really be ordinary people? 2 ordinary people treating a second-rank apprentice with such casual ease. Could it be that Baton Academy had an internal hierarchy beyond magical strength? Doomer said a few more words to the 2, this time not using transmission magic, then returned holding a thin booklet. He handed the booklet to Saul with both hands while explaining, "Kaugust is a bit different from other cities. Its living conditions might not match your usual preferences. If you need anything, you can refer to the guide, or I can find you a local escort." The cover of the booklet read, "Kaugust City Life Guide." Saul took the booklet. "No need, I'll read it myself." "Very well, then I won't disturb you any longer." Doomer stepped aside, still wearing a somewhat stiff smile. "I wish you an enjoyable stay in Kaugust." With that, he turned and headed back through the corridor. Saul was about to climb into the carriage with the guide when something in the corner of his eye made him pause. He turned his head slightly, leaning back a bit, the fingers holding the booklet tensed. Doomer, walking away from him and into the corridor, had, of all things, a flat disc for a head. Saul immediately glanced at the 2 fake birds flying above the passage. No mistake. From the back, Doomer's head was identical to Bird's. The only question was, if he turned around, would that disc be embedded with 36 black eyeballs as well? "What is going on?" Saul pretended to rub his eyes, then opened them again, and sure enough, Doomer, walking through the corridor, still had that disc-shaped head. Doomer, Saul called out. Doomer turned at once, but in the very instant he turned, his disc-like head returned to its normal human form. "Is there anything else I can help with, Lord Saul?" Doomer's shoulders hunched slightly, like a mischievous child caught by his mother. "Oh, I gave it some thought. Never mind." Doomer said nothing, only bowed again with a smile, then turned and continued walking away. This time Saul kept his eyes on him, and the head did not change again. Just as Saul was about to climb into the carriage, something atop Doomer's head caught the light and flickered. Narrowing his eyes, Saul saw a thin strand extending from the center of Doomer's scalp. Faintly white, faintly translucent. The strand curved and wavered as it floated upward, like chimney smoke at dinner time. Only about a meter of the strand was visible, the end disappearing into the air. What now? Saul got into the carriage, resting his chin on one hand as he watched the scenery of the city unfold like a painting through the window. Suddenly he smiled. This city is pretty interesting. Chapter 460, A Slight Unease. From the outside, Kaugus City felt completely different than living inside it. The carriage moved along a road that wasn't particularly wide. Compared to the towering buildings on both sides, some with dozens of floors, the narrowness of the road made those otherwise magnificent structures feel suddenly oppressive. Especially when traveling between the two rows of buildings, the massive shadows they cast brought a damp and weighty darkness to the ground below. And up close, those towering buildings didn't seem so magnificent after all. The windows were tiny, so small that even an adult would struggle to climb out through one. The densely packed windows made one feel stifled, like countless eyes hidden behind the walls, watching and coveting everything on the streets. In stark contrast to these dense and oppressive buildings was the surprising emptiness of the street itself. Only occasionally did a few oddly shaped rickshaws speed by. Saul glanced at them. They seemed to run on gears and other mechanical parts, but were quite fast. Marsh was clearly distracted by the spectacle too, and couldn't maintain his usual speed. His carriage was quickly overtaken by the rickshaws. Then came a loud humming from above. Marsh looked up to see a small airship flying about 10 meters overhead. As the sky gradually darkened, black pillars lining the road suddenly lit up, startling the horses pulling the carriage. Seeing this, Saul couldn't help but marvel with a tinge of doubt. The moment the lights turned on, there was a pulse of magic. That means at least one kind of magical infrastructure runs through this entire district. If it were just an isolated facility like a wizard tower, using such magical devices would still be considered reasonable, but this was an entire city. Kaugust, or rather, the Baton Academy behind it. How had they managed to pour this much magical resource into serving ordinary people? Wasn't the base-level productivity of magic far too low for that? 5 minutes later, Saul finally arrived at the destination marked on the guide manual map. The brokerage center. According to the guide, this place handled everything from job hunting, house hunting, even spouse matchmaking and various other intermediary matters. It was the first recommended stop for anyone newly arriving in Kaugus City. Even if one was just visiting, this was the place to find a suitable guide. As soon as the carriage stopped beneath a particularly square-shaped tall building, Saul heard faint harp music drifting down from the buildings on both sides. And then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the buildings on both sides suddenly erupted with a chorus of noise. Dark figures began emerging from various doorways, gradually merging into the street like a gloomy flood. So many people, even Agu, who had seen quite a bit, was stunned by the sight. And it wasn't just the buildings on their sides. Ahead of them, buildings on the next street over, all of them began spewing out streams of people. The already narrow street was immediately crammed full. Everywhere one looked, aside from a few rickshaws, Everyone was traveling on foot. Most of the passers-by had numb expressions, only showing a hint of life when exchanging a few words in hushed tones. They've centralized the entire surrounding population into Kaugus City. Saul rested his chin on his hand, looking out the window. The scene before him stirred some old memories. Mass population concentration, highly regimented lifestyles, the constant lure of serialized novels to draw people into the city. The city's master is turning people into mere components of the urban machine. What is he trying to do? Hearing Saul's analysis, Agu spoke in a low voice. The true master of Kaugust is Baton Academy, and its current head is their old dean, Pond, a second-rank wizard. Baton Academy sold various magic tools to the outside world. It was even said that as long as one had enough money, even those with poor magic or mental aptitude could become wizard apprentices. Baton Academy was casting a wide net. Not only were wizard apprentices caught in it, even the little fish, the ordinary folks, weren't spared. They must be working on some major project. By now, the stream of people emerging from the buildings had begun to thin. Saul leapt down from the carriage. No point overthinking it. Right now, we're just a pair of tenants looking for a place to stay. On the surface, Marsh stayed behind. But hidden below, one of little Algy's clones burrowed into the soil to keep watch. Saul only brought a storage bag with essential items and Agu, and the two entered the red, square-shaped building on the right. Once inside, they encountered more marvels, an automatically guarded gate that required a pass to open. There were elevator-like chambers that could go up and down, though they required manual operation by a designated attendant. It seemed the harp music earlier marked the end of the workday. There weren't many people inside the building now. The elevator brought them up to the 20th floor, which was the top of the building. The top floor was an oval-shaped hall. There were likely hidden rooms on both sides. The center was empty except for a few long benches, and a ring of counters surrounded the room. Posters and scraps of paper littered the floor, and someone was cleaning up. As soon as Saul entered, he saw a boy pulling a woman, both arguing with another woman behind one of the counters, apparently over rent. He glanced at the sign above the counter. It was indeed the rental section. Saul walked over to the next counter and asked, "Do you have housing available for wizards?" The man behind the counter had been looking down at some documents. Hearing Saul's voice, he looked up and immediately broke into a beaming smile, tossing his papers aside without a care. "Of course, my lord, welcome to Kaugust." In just 10 minutes, Saul had a key in hand. It looked like a copper leaf with constantly shifting patterns etched on it. When Saul pressed a certain spot, the pattern stopped moving. The man who'd helped him was all smiles, escorting Saul to the entrance. At first, he had been just professionally polite, producing a standard booklet of housing options. But the moment Saul picked a place and pulled out a silver pass for registration, the man's expression changed dramatically. His demeanor grew twice as respectful, and he even brought out a different, more exclusive housing catalog from the back room. The apartment Saul had originally selected was the top floor of a tall building. The new catalog only listed villas. After a brief glance and price comparison, Saul still went with his original choice. He had no choice. His wizard tower was gone, and he still had a mini wizard tower, 4 consciousness entities, and 2 pets to support. He had to keep expenses down. Despite Saul not choosing the larger, pricier option, the agent showed no disappointment. As Saul was leaving, he even respectfully offered a business card with both hands. "This is my card, basically my personal info. It has our communication code on it. If you need anything, you can reach the brokerage center through the communicator in your room. I can personally come serve you." The familiar scene stirred a bit of nostalgia in Saul. He took the card and looked down. "John, Saul thought of a certain novel and looked up. You wouldn't happen to be that farmer boy John from the story, would you? The man named John gave a sheepish grin. Actually, ever since that novel got popular, a lot of people started calling themselves John, hopping to get lucky like he did. Taking the card, Saul once again declined the offer to use an AirPod for transport. No reason he'd have to pay. Back at the carriage, Agu looked utterly dumbfounded. Saul, though outwardly calm, was just as shocked internally. If he hadn't noticed that many of the tools were built on magic rune logic, he really would have thought some omnipotent transmigrator had become the city's master. But in the end, he was sure, though some things looked similar to Earth, at their core they were fundamentally different. Back on the carriage, Saul had little Algie withdraw its underground clone and gave Marsh the directions to head to their new home. But just as the wheels began to turn, little Algie suddenly extended from behind Saul's neck, flopping its head onto his face. Little Algie, what are you doing?" Little Algie wiggled in the air and wrote a word. "Tree." Everyone leaned in. "Tree, what tree, which tree?" Penny chattered on. "There's a stroke missing from the character," Agu said, frowning. But Saul froze. "Now that you mention it, I haven't seen a single tree here." He slowly looked down at the ground. "The tree you're talking about, could it be underground?"